Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. We are here with Ken Kraybill again today, and we are going to learn about motivational interviewing. So one thing, if you could please put your name and your organization and your title in the chat so that we know who's on the line today, and then we'll get started. Go ahead, Ken.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and happy Thursday morning. That was your moment of Zen with this young drummer, Nandi Bushell. So I'm guessing that many of you were with me today. We were together yesterday with the trauma-informed care training. And so I welcome you back. If you were not with us, I welcome you, of course, as well. And today we're going to be exploring this thing we call motivational interviewing. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and then I'll go ahead and we'll start talking together about this. So just by way of introduction once again, and also my contact with motivational interviewing. As I mentioned yesterday, I'm a social worker. I've worked in homelessness most of my life, in direct service for about 18 years, and began in the 1980s, early 1980s, working at Downtown Emergency Service Center in Seattle. And at the time, I was fresh out of graduate school. I'd learned some cognitive behavioral things, learned about, resources and learned about social systems and this kind of thing. But there was really nothing quite that prepared me to come work in a large shelter facility with people who were experiencing all manner of challenges in their lives. So we kind of flew by the seat of our pants most of the time. And I did bring a spirit of interest and compassion and caring that I think actually served me very well. But I'm not sure how skillful I was in actually having conversations with people. In the early 1990s, a book came out in 1991 called Motivational Interviewing. And I remember first hearing about it, and then within a year or two, having an opportunity to attend a workshop in Seattle on motivational interviewing. And the workshop was actually paired with two other topics, one of those being harm reduction, and the other being, I don't remember what it was. It might have been trauma, I'm not sure. But at any rate, that's when I was first introduced to what I'll call MI. And, it was something that from the outset, I didn't kind of fully embrace it. And yet at the same time, it was very intriguing to me because it really resonated with kind of who I wanted to be in the world as a social worker and as a human being. I so appreciated the piece about it that really focused on kind of the attitude, the mindset, the heart set, the spirit of what we bring of ourselves to the conversation. I also really appreciated the skills that were being taught. And so I have to say that over time, I gradually opened up to really beginning to embrace this approach. And it's certainly not a be all and end all. And it's something that, I can't say it forever changed my life, but I think it made a significant impact on how I have been as a person and a social worker ever since. And so this is one of the various best practices that has come along over the last number of years, particularly in homelessness, but also even around healthcare and behavioral healthcare, in addition to trauma-informed care, which is what we talked about yesterday. So we're going to explore motivational interviewing. We have about a little less than 4 hours together. Again, we'll take some breaks around more or less each hour for about 7 or 8 minutes just to get a break. Again, I invite you to find ways to self-regulate and breathe and make yourself comfortable. I know that this is a pretty lengthy amount of time to spend on Zoom. And so, I just recognize that you'll need to do what you need to do to stay engaged. I certainly invite you to use the chat box liberally. And even though we're a fairly sizable group, if it's possible to unmute at times to say something that maybe is easier to say out loud than in the chat box, I welcome that. So one of the quotes I came across early in my career, which is attributed to St. Francis of Assisi, who I also believe was a community health worker, much like many of you on this call. But the quote is, "We are called to heal wounds, to unite what has fallen apart, and to bring home those who have lost their way." And it always has kind of resonated with me because it does in fact fit with my own desires, and I imagine many, if not all of you, your own sort of heartfelt desires to be somebody in the world who makes a difference in helping people find healing and recovery, to help people be connected in more healthy ways, and certainly for people who are lost in their way, whether that's literally without housing or the homelessness that exists perhaps in all of us at times where we feel loneliness and feel disconnect. I think it is our job to help people find a sense of home. And for me, this quote really embodies what I think motivational interviewing is about. It's really about helping people look into the mirror of their lives, to have a conversation with another person, but also with themselves about who they are, what their values are, what their behaviors and actions are, their attitudes, and how all of that fits together. And I really think of MI as being a way to help people become their best selves in terms of their physical health, their mental health, their social connections, and so much more. So for today's session together, we're going to review how it is that MI is more of a guiding style than a directive one when it comes to helping people. We'll also look at what are the 4 elements of the so-called spirit of MI, or the heart set, the attitude set. We'll also look at some processes that help us sort of place ourselves in a conversation in terms of where we are in that conversation, and they can serve as a map or a guide that helps us understand, what we're putting our emphasis on at different points in any given conversation with somebody. We'll look at some of the core interviewing skills that we use in MI. We'll look at 4 of them, and hope you can at least provide examples of 2 when we're finished. And also, we're going to look at this notion of what we call change talk. And that is simply when people talk about change in a meaningful way, or perhaps a dissatisfaction with how things are, we want to particularly pay attention to that, because what we know is that when we invite people to talk about their hopes, their aspirations, how they might go about making a change, who could help them, how important is it to them, these kinds of things, it actually is a way that people begin to talk themselves into changing, which is really what motivational interviewing is. And so in very succinct terms, rather than our trying to talk people into change or get them to change or make them change, MI is all about helping to create the conditions for people to convince themselves to change and to talk themselves into change. So let's begin with a quiz. And the very first question I'll ask you is whether the image that I'm going to put on the screen is MI. And MI, of course, is shorthand for motivational interviewing. And motivational interviewing is kind of a lot to say, a mouthful to say. So out of curiosity, if you would put in the chat box or just unmute and tell me whether or not this is MI, and if it is, what is it? I invite you to do that. Anybody know if that's MI and what is it? This is your geography test for the morning. It is a map, and it is Michigan. Thank you. Good job, Katie. It is a portrayal of the state of Michigan with the glove and all of that. And it is MI, but it's not what we came to talk about today. How about this? This is also MI, but what is it? What is this called?
Myocardial infarction.
Thank you. And it is fun to say, isn't it? It is a heart, but it's more technically a heart attack, a myocardial infarction, also an MI, or is MI. Anybody know this one? This could possibly date you a little bit, or you're just a...
Mission Impossible.
Very good. It is indeed the original TV cast of Mission Impossible, a show that I know that I watched a little bit in the 1960s and maybe 70s, I'm not sure. It is MI, but of course, what we really came to talk about today is something a little different. And so you're seeing here the third edition of Motivational Interviewing. And those of you, I'm sure many of you have some familiarity with MI already, and perhaps you've picked up books and read them. This particular third edition came out in 2013. And it is the book that I would recommend picking up if you're eager to explore further and learn more about MI. The first edition that came out was really focused primarily on substance abuse treatment. That was the focus of MI originally. And then it gradually became something that became part of a practice in behavioral health and healthcare and corrections and schools and well beyond. Anywhere where people are having conversations with other people about the possibility of making any changes in their lives, often MI has come into play as a helpful tool for an approach for doing that. So I'm, like I said, quite confident you already have, many of you have had some familiarity with MI, and some of you don't, and that's perfectly fine. Some of you are kind of a blank slate. But for those of you who do know something about it, what are some words and phrases that come to mind when you think about motivational interviewing that describe it, that are characteristics of MI, just in your own terms? I'm not looking for book definitions or anything like that, but what do you already think about and know about this? So yes, a therapeutic alliance, and we're including and inviting lots of inputs and using open-ended questions.
Active listening.
Active listening, absolutely. Yeah. Another way of thinking about reflective listening. Sometimes we use these scaling questions. Yeah. We roll when there's pushback. We don't get too bent out of shape about it. We roll with it. We recognize that within that resistance, there's also some kind of ambivalence probably. And we're really continuing to keep people engaged and interacted and actively involved in their own decision-making, their own care. And in that sense, it's deeply person-centered. Yeah, these are all great. Anything else that comes to mind? So you've really, we've got a good start here. And so let's talk a little bit about a brief history of this approach, and then we're going to look a little bit more at some of the ingredients in MI. And those of you who are continuing to add things, absolutely meeting and understanding people where they are and working with them. There's an affirming, encouraging aspect to it, a real strengths-based aspect to it. So all good. So as I mentioned, this is a practice that actually came and flowed out of the experience of William Miller, a psychologist who was actually an intern, I believe it was, in a an alcohol treatment program, an inpatient program in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, many years ago. And he tells the story of walking in there, and his intent was to be there and to observe the treatment that was taking place and be part of it. But no one gave him any particular sense of direction when he first walked in. So he sat down and he just started to mingle and interact with these folks who were in this inpatient program. And during breaks and things, they were sitting around and talking, and he got to know them. And they were mostly people from the Midwest, particularly from the state of Wisconsin. And so I apologize to any Wisconsinites here, Badgers, but he kind of got to know them for sort of stereotypically what we think of as Wisconsinites. They eat a lot of cheese, right? And they wear cheese on their heads when they root for the Green Bay Packers. And they drink a fair amount of beer, right? And they also, though, are farmers, and they those who don't live in the city, and they're people who hunt and fish, and they have families. And so William Miller got to know them for who they were as human beings in the world. And then he says he made the mistake, quote unquote, of going and reading the literature about alcoholism, alcoholics in general. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with this history, particularly in the US, but what was the thinking and attitude set around alcoholics and about alcoholism, particularly in the 1960s, 70s, and it still persists today, actually. But how were people characterized if they were misusing alcohol? Any thoughts? Yeah, many ended up on Skid Row because that was kind of the stereotype of people whose lives had been ruined because they had low moral character. They weren't people of very high ethics, and they were kind of losers. Absolutely. They were people who they weren't strong enough somehow to live up to who they ought to have been. And so they were seen as people who they were seen in a disparaging manner and in a kind of very judgmental, kind of a judgy kind of way, right? In the literature, there were references, for example, that these were folks who were pathological liars. And one of the reasons for that is because often when you had a conversation with somebody, like on Skid Row, even though it was so very evident that alcohol was a huge part of their lives, they would still say things that either minimized or even say, that's not a problem for me. I don't have an alcohol problem. And of course, it seemed baffling on the face of it. I think what they were doing is just trying to save face, but it was taken by many people at face value. And the implication was that they were in denial about their alcohol or other substance use. And so denial became the organizing idea around treatment. And so if you are in denial about something, that in that context, that means for them that you can't recognize what's going on. You can't recognize the impact of your behavior on other people. You can't recognize the impact on your own health, because people kept saying, yeah, this isn't a problem for me. And so, of course, the idea was that you had to break down that denial, and it was kind of seen as a wall. And so if you have a wall of denial, depending on the thickness, you try to get rid of it. You try to knock it down. And so, in real life, we get rid of walls by kicking them down and punching them down and taking hammers and sledgehammers to them and do everything we can to push them over, maybe bulldoze them over. In treatment settings, the way people tried to get rid of that denial and knock that wall down was through high levels of confrontation, very in your face, yelling, screaming even at people, telling them to stop their stinking thinking was one of the things that was talked about. But there was also an element of shaming that took place. And the idea here was well-intended. The thought was, if you can shame a person enough that they'll let go of that denial, and then the idea would be that they would be ripe and ready to consider change, and they could see more clearly. Well, I don't know about you, but I know that when people are confrontive towards me, when they are shaming me, the last thing I want to do is make a change in a positive direction. And that's precisely what was going on in these treatment settings. Is there was conformity taking place to ensure that they stayed within the rules and were not the ones who were targeted of being confronted, but these were not genuine, long-lasting changes. These were just things to do to get out of the spotlight, um, and to get away from the sledgehammers. And so William Miller walked into this context and he observed all this, and it really was what gave him the impetus to say, there's got to be a better way to go about this. And so he did a lot of thinking. He borrowed from people like Carl Rogers, from a guy named Darrell Bem, and from medical ethics, and from students and other people he talked with, eventually from Stephen Rolnick, his co-author. But in the development of this way of approaching people, he was actually tapping into ancient wisdom in many ways, but he was framing it in a way that has become very helpful for clinicians throughout the world, in all cultures virtually, to use an approach that is very humane, humanistic, is very person-centered, strengths-based, and really honors people's autonomy and their value and intrinsic worth, and all of those things. That's the brief history. You actually can hear William Miller on audio tape on YouTube, and I'm sending you some of those materials that you can reference. But talk about that in terms of how MI evolved. It's a very interesting story. I may have gotten a few details off, but I think I got it mostly right. So, using a cooking metaphor, I'd like to share with you kind of the overall picture of what are the active ingredients in motivational interviewing, or in motivational conversations, as we might call them. And then we'll come back and revisit them. So we talk about the 4 elements of the spirit of MI, the 4 guiding processes, the 4 core conversational skills that we use to move through these processes and within the spirit. And the teaspoons of change talk refers to the different ways that people express an interest in change. And I'll just share a few more details in a moment about these. But what we do is we take these ingredients and we mix them together, and we fold them and spoon them and maybe knead them a little bit with our hands. But the idea is we use these different elements of MI kind of in a way that invites people to consider their own lives and what's going on. And the reason we allow it to simmer is because change itself rarely comes easily. In fact, most of the changes that any of us have made of some significance have taken quite a while to come to the point of even the tipping point of taking action. And so we have to really respect the fact that when people are engaged in behaviors that they've been engaged for quite a long time, that it's going to take some time to also undo or come to a decision about changing those behaviors. And so, again, just to take these a little further, just so you have some acquaintance with some of the terms that we'll be coming back to, we're talking here about the spirit elements of partnering with people, of conveying acceptance, of compassion and evocation. We also here talk about the processes of also, usually we begin with an engaging process with people, getting to know them, and then there's a focusing process in which we kind of come to a decision together about what it is we're going to put our attention on at the moment. And then the evoking around that, and you see how that reflects the evocation spirit as well in the 4 elements. But the evoking is really taking whatever that focus is and then asking interesting questions and providing good reflective statements back to help that person examine further and elaborate on on why it is they might change. And then eventually we might get to a planning process of indicating next steps. We use these skills. They're not unique in MI, but we use open questions, affirmations, reflections, summaries. They form this acronym of ORS, which many of you are familiar with. And so those are the key core interviewing skills that we use to help move conversations along. And then we're always on the lookout for what we call change talk, anything that indicates a desire or an interest in change. It might be, I'd really like things to be different, kind of a global desire. It might mean stating an ability. I think I could probably do this or that to reach that goal. I've got reasons. There would be benefits if I did this. And there's a need here. There's an urgency here that it's important to me. And then sometimes it moves to, hopefully, I'm going to do it. I'm going to commit. I'm going to take steps and try it out. So for those of you unfamiliar with this, this is probably just a lot of words on a page, and I apologize. For others of you, some of these terms have meaning, but it's my intent throughout our time together today to kind of explore each of these in a little more detail and provide a little activity for us to interact with as well. Any thoughts on that before we move forward? I welcome your comments. And as you think about that, what I'd like to do now is share some video with you. I have 2 video demos, each are about 3.5, 4 minutes long. The one video that I'm going to show you first is an example of how not to do MI. So this is the bad example video. It turns out that this is a dental practice. It's a dentist talking with her patient, David, who has come in to have some teeth repaired. But she also opens up a conversation about his overall oral health, and particularly around his tobacco use. And so the focus of the conversation ultimately is on David and his use of tobacco. And it turns out that the dentist is concerned about this, not unsurprisingly. And so she does her best to be helpful to him in this conversation that you'll observe. Now, when we're finished observing it, I'm going to ask you some questions in the chat box. For example, I'll ask you, what are her hopes for the patient? What are her methods of trying to get him to stop smoking? What is the outcome? How does it impact David himself? And so questions like that. So bear those in mind. Any of you who want to even make comment as we're listening to the video of what you're observing that's maybe less than helpful in particular, feel free to do so. Here we go.
Okay, so why don't you have a rinse, David? How are you feeling?
Okay.
Good. Here, take a look. See what you think. That feeling, and the color's okay? You know, there is quite a lot of staining, so I'm just wondering about some concerns about smoking, possibly
Gonna get that again.
coffee, tea. Yeah, you've heard this
I do
before, I'm
all
sure.
the above, yeah.
So, you know, the smoking is going to be related not just to some of the other negative consequences, you know, physically. It affects dental caries, dental cavities, healing in your mouth.
Okay, sure.
So,
I've heard it all. But I just want to get my teeth fixed.
yes, and I really want to be helpful. I really want to, you know, my commitment is to your oral health. So there are lots of medications out there, David, that actually take away a lot of the cravings. They're They make quitting
I did
so
the
much
pill
easier.
thing, so I did try. I did try. I just did the pills and they didn't work. It was
Yeah.
it was a waste and it caused more side effects.
No, but David, it's not a waste. Research shows that people take on average about 7 tries before they quit smoking. So think of it as you're one step closer to quitting.
Or 7
So-
lectures along the road.
Well, I don't think I'm giving you a lecture. That's certainly not what I meant.
No, I just feel that way. I get very defensive about it when they bring, because I get it from my family doc, my cardiologist, everybody. I'm not a complete fool. I am for smoking,
Well, there's a reason
but
that
it's
people are
not
concerned.
easy to quit.
No, but as I said, these medications, so you've tried the medication, you've been willing once,
Yeah.
then can I write you a prescription for the medication? Can we talk about how you could use it? Because this is something that's very important, not just for your overall physical health.
I guess I got to really want to. And things I've tried usually cause me more problems than they helped.
Oh no, the smoking's going to cause you more problems than anything else. I can promise you that, David.
Okay.
The side effects from the medications are nothing compared to what can happen from the smoking. Like that's the, I think, thing to really consider.
Okay, well, can I go now?
I'm okay, but you know,
I know, Doc, what you're trying to do, but I just don't want to get into that right now.
okay. Well, thanks for listening. And honestly, I am really worried about the smoking. So
Okay.
I
I appreciate your caring.
I'm here to help. Okay.
Okay.
Well, I'm certainly seeing your comments in the chat box, and they resonate with me for sure. He certainly is uncomfortable. He's not interested in wanting to have this conversation right now, but she sure does, right? And she's really not being very respectful. She's actually being pretty directive and pushy, persistent, coercive, shaming, perhaps. It's not horrible. It's not over the top, but it's horrible enough that he's not likely to get his to go out and consider stopping smoking. So let's answer some questions here for ourselves. First question, and I'll answer it myself because I think we all understand that she does have hopes for this person, for David, and that is he would stop smoking and improve his oral health. And she wants to help. She says very clearly, I want to help, right? Which always is a red flag in my view. But I think, her intentions are good. The question that we probably really want to look at, though, is what are the methods that she is using and how are they dissonant with her intentions? So I'm seeing a lot of you saying she's not meeting where he's at. The concern now is that he will not come back. So these methods are actually pushing him away and maybe inducing guilt, as some of you are saying. But what is she doing? Let's name what she's doing. I hear the descriptions here, but one thing that comes to my mind is she's providing what we would call patient education, right? Maybe not in a very helpful way, but she's doing what she thinks she ought to do as a care provider who is sort of assuming that if only he had a little bit more information and pressure, it would be enough to tip him in the direction of change. And her methods are, of course, to educate, if you will, to insist, to really show her seriousness about this. But they really are not falling on listening ears, are they, at all? What do you imagine might be the impact, the outcome on David? And if one of you would be willing, I'd love for you to unmute and just talk about what's going on with David as he gets up and leaves the office, if you will, and goes out to let's say he goes out to his car. What's he doing? What's he going to do? What's he thinking about? What's going on in his mind? Anybody care to just give a brief description of what's going through your head?
He's going to find another dentist.
He's going to look for another dentist. Yeah, he's not so sure he wants to come back to her.
Yeah,
Probably he's going to go smoke a cigarette.
he's absolutely going to go smoke a cigarette. I'm
100%.
thinking he's going to light up to it at the same time, even. So
Yeah, he's probably just really stressed and angry, and just, he feels like everybody's just, he can't catch a break with it. So it's
Yep.
gonna make him fall further into it and just want to keep doing it more and more, because he just feels like no matter what he does, it comes from all around him. So can't catch a break.
yeah, no, that's well put. And as he says, he's hearing it from other people as well. And so we actually know from the research that if you continually tell somebody, in this case, to stop smoking, and keep badgering them about it, that it's most likely that they'll go out and not only continue smoking, but even increase their smoking, smoke even more. Just this kind of a way of saying, you can't tell me what to do. So yeah, he goes out to his car, he lights up a cigarette, but there's nothing likely going through his mind about quitting or doing something differently. It's all about what just happened. And now there's discord, we call it in MI, between him and the dentist. And, I think in real life, she's a nice enough person and she's trying to do her job as best as she knows how. But the impact is really very much in contradiction to what she's hoping for. So, thank you, Carol, for quoting me, and I quoted somebody else. But yeah, that's an apt quote. People who want to help in the worst possible way often do. And so I think it's worth thinking for ourselves, though, in our own ways. How do we potentially come across in similar ways, not because we intend to, but because we feel this pressure? Maybe it's pressure from our programs, our supervisors, our funders, but we feel this pressure to make outcomes happen and have them come out. And so then we begin to apply these different methods that are attempting to get people to change. And what do you hear in that comment of getting people to change? I need to get that person to understand. I need to get that person.
Seems like it has more to do with the professional's ability to, like, authority and power to make an individual change. It has nothing to do with the person changing.
Yeah, it's really acting as if you have power to even change in this place, which no one does. And it's also coercive, isn't it? It's got some violence around the edges there. When you're going to get somebody to do something, it means you're going to do something that does something beyond what they're willing oftentimes. Well, I appreciate these comments, and we don't need to linger forever. And I think we've already discussed what was less than helpful. So I'd like you to use your imagination now, and let's pretend that maybe it's, I don't know, 9 months later, a year later, maybe it's the next visit. But anyway, she has had the opportunity to go through some training in motivational interviewing and to reflect on her practice. And she has decided to kind of use a different approach. So let's listen to that. And again, I welcome all your comments in the chat box. So let's see what's different.
Okay, David, so why don't you take a rinse, and how are you feeling?
Pretty good.
Would you like to check this
yeah.
out? What do you think?
Oh, that one's fixed really nice.
Yeah.
You got rid of that bad
Yeah.
discoloration that was there.
Yeah. No,
I like
think
that.
It went well. Good. Excellent. I did notice quite a lot of staining, actually. I'm wondering, what are your thoughts about what might be related to that?
Well, the usual suspects. Smoking, wine, coffee,
Yeah.
all of the above.
Any thoughts on considering quitting smoking at this time?
Yeah, I thought about it. It's not my cup of tea. I hear it from everybody, and I've tried before. It didn't work. I get it all the time.
Okay. And it's like, here I am, one more person, the next doctor who's saying, you need to quit smoking, David.
And
And I'm sorry, that's not how I mean to come across
and
at all.
I know I'm not an idiot. People know that smokers are, how can you smoke today? It's just not that easy to quit.
And if it was as easy as a doctor saying, or your partner saying,
Who wouldn't be?
You have to
You'd have to
quit.
be a real fool not to do it if
Yeah.
you was going to make it like that.
yeah,
I just hear it every day.
yeah. And what's been your past experience with smoking? Can you tell me a little bit about kind of how the role it plays in your life, how long you've smoked?
Yeah, I've smoked for 40 years, since I was 14. And quit a couple of times, off and on in the 20s, but it's been consistent. And I can't see myself changing now, no matter what kind of talk I get or what they come up with.
It sounds like almost you've tried a lot of things that are out there, and it's not something
Not
that
going to
you're...
work for me.
Yeah, yeah,
No.
yeah.
I know cold turkey is probably the only thing that's ever going to do it. Anybody that's done it, my group, it's been cold turkey, and then they fight it. But it's my choice, and I don't like lectures about it.
Yeah, and it really is your choice. You're absolutely right that nobody has the right to tell you what to do. Can I ask, if there was to be a situation where you decided I must quit, what would that situation be?
Hard to tell, because I've already had open heart surgery. That didn't do it. Prostate cancer, that didn't do it.
Right.
I don't know. I really don't know. I just don't really want it.
So this is something that you
Have to-
pretty much see yourself doing for...
Yeah, quite a while yet.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I really appreciate you being willing to even talk about it. And I get that right now this is not something that you want to pursue. Would it be okay if I brought it up at our next visit? Because I know that you've said you don't want to lecture, but on the other hand, I am concerned.
Okay, yeah, I could go for that. I'm always open to, to listen.
As long as I don't talk too
Yeah.
much. Okay.
There could be options. I had my surgeon just go like, why do I even keep you as a patient? He's good though.
You were glad to keep him as a doctor.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and David, honestly, wherever you're at, we'll work with it.
Okay.
And thanks for taking minutes and talking about smoking.
Thanks, Doc.
Okay, thanks.
Again, loving the chat box comments you're all making. The tone changes pretty quickly, doesn't it? And you see a lot more partnering going on, a lot more listening. She asked him to tell her about how he perceived the reasons for the staining rather than her assuming and telling him. Sorry, needing to find my cursor here. There we go. And so she's inviting his thoughts. What are your thoughts about this? And really engaging him in this conversation. And as many of you are saying, she's really addressing his discomfort and creating a sense of safety and comfort. And using just some wonderful listening skills. She's using reflective statements. She's using some really good, interesting questions. She's validating what she's hearing. She's not judging. And she's really inviting him to be actively participating in it. Mary says, honoring his views, reflecting back what she hears, asking permission, providing dignity. What a beautiful summation, Mary Virginia, of that kind of collection of those ingredients, if you will. And at the end, she leaves the door open to re-engage. She's not insisting that he do anything other than she does express her concern, which is certainly legit, and says, at least would it be all right if we could have this conversation again? So her hopes haven't changed, have they, from the first round? She still is hopeful that he'll quit smoking and improve his oral health, but her methods have clearly changed. And you've already noted, and you're welcome to add more, sort of the techniques, if you will, the communication or the conversational skills she uses. I'm actually just going to walk through a few of the details just to put emphasis on them. But as many of you have noted, one of the first things she says, she gets to the point, right? She says, I noticed some staining here. What are your thoughts about that? And then, of course, he tells her. And then she doesn't beat around the bush. She still, maybe more than I would probably, and maybe some of us, but she says, any thoughts on considering smoking? But she says it in a way that doesn't feel like it's a demand or an expectation, but just curious. Any thoughts on considering smoking? Well, that's a beautiful open question, to which he replies with the whole narrative of smoking. And he goes on to talk with her then about how long he's smoked and the ways he's tried to quit. And he makes that comment at one point, if it were as easy, he's suggesting that I would have done it a long time ago. And that's one of the key points where she just says, yeah, if it were as easy, then you wouldn't need me to tell you about this, right? So she's showing a lot of empathy in all of this. And then she goes on to say, and some of these are reflections which he doesn't actually say, but she's making a guess, and that's what good reflections do. They kind of make an educated guess. She says, it sounds like you've tried a lot of things out there. And he says, yeah, and they're not going to work for me. But he does say at one point, he says, cold turkey is probably the only thing. And he's sort of suggesting that if he ever were to try stopping, that would be what he would try. And then goes on to say, I don't like lectures. And she says, yeah, you're absolutely right. It is your choice, as he said, it's my choice. And she says, you're absolutely right. And there she's really honoring that autonomy. And she's making it very transparently clear that she's not there to try to get him to do something, because it ultimately is his choice. And so she meets him where he's at, as we say, right? I think too, there's this, well, she asked some really key questions. And if you remember, there was one question she asked in the first round, and that was, can I write you a prescription? Here, she asks a number of key questions. Any thoughts on considering quitting smoking? She says, what's been your past experience with smoking? So there she kind of goes back into the past and tell me about you and smoking, your relationship to smoking. And that's when he begins to volunteer kind of the story around smoking. And he's been doing it for 40 years, right? And she doesn't reply and say, whoa, that's a really long time, because that would have been pushing a little bit too much. So she just takes in that information. But there's a place where she asks a question which is very kind of future oriented, and one that I really hope that you come away from this time together today of thinking about ways that you can ask interesting questions of people that have a future focus. And hers is, if there was a situation where you said, I must quit, what would that be? And it's that if you were to come to a place in your life where you decided to stop, what would be going on? What would have happened or something like that? It's just helping people imagine a different future, which is such a key part of motivational interviewing. Now, he goes on to say, well, I don't know, because prostate cancer didn't do it, open heart surgery didn't do it. I really don't want it. And I think at some points, I know in the past, I might have done this, and maybe you too. If somebody were to say, I really don't want it, we would have taken that at face value and said, well, okay, with a little bit of disgust probably in our voices, and say, but if you ever do want it, come back and let's talk. And instead of approaching it that way, she does invite him to come back and talk, but she does it in a very am I consistent way. And she says, it sounds like you pretty much see yourself doing this for a while. And yet I am concerned. Would it be all right if at least I brought it up again at our next visit? And so she keeps the conversation going. She's not pushing it beyond where it needs to go, but she's keeping the door open and inviting him to keep the door open to have more conversation. Yeah, can we talk about this again? Can we keep this conversation alive at least? Because even though he is saying, I don't see any time that I'm going to quit soon, I really don't want it, we also detect in him some ambivalence. And that comes up in the fact that you can kind of tell there's a wrestling match going on inside. And he even brings up the possibility of how he might go about changing, cold turkey or something. Now, let me ask this again. I'd ask you to unmute and speak out, but what's David's experience now? He gets up, he leaves, he walks out to the car. I'm pretty certain he lights a cigarette. But what else is going on now? What's going through his mind? What's he thinking? What's he wondering about? What's he pondering?
What's he thinking about changing? Are we thinking about maybe there is a possibility, an opportunity?
Yeah. It's like, at least he's curious about it. He's not shut down the possibility, right? Yeah, thanks, Gerardo. He's thinking that, maybe he has that cigarette and, like I have a pen in my hand, right? And he's saying, 40 years, huh? And the taste isn't all that good anymore. It was at one time. It's really not doing what it used to.
Or maybe even who could he quit with? Is there someone who he could buddy up with, or what could his game plan be to quit?
Yeah, he might be thinking already, like, it's hard to do this stuff on my own. And I've tried. I wonder, I've got some buddies who have done it. I know some other people, and I wonder, maybe if I had somebody with me to companion me and who had my back. We don't know what he's thinking, but what we do know is his mind is open and not closed, and he's open to consider the possibilities. I'm not convinced that he's going to do anything dramatically in the near future, but you never know. He might actually even begin toying around with change by deciding, okay, I smoke this many cigarettes a day. Maybe I could cut back even just one a day and see what that's like. I don't know. I mean, we just don't know. But what we do know is the conditions have been created in which the seed has been planted for him to begin thinking about the possibility of change. And that's exactly what we would hope for an outcome. Now, sure, it would have been great had he said, okay, doc, I see the lights and I'm going to go join a program and I'm going to quit and so on and so forth. But that would have been kind of dubious, actually, change talk, I think, because it feels too premature. So what we really bank on in MI is having relatively brief conversations with people about change, but banking on the fact that they'll continue having that conversation with themselves. And it's very interesting. You probably have your own stories about when you've been mulling over a change, whether it's for months or years, and then you kind of come to a tipping point where you say, I've got to do something about this. I'm going to do something about this. And it seems oftentimes those things come to us in the middle of the night when we wake up, or when we wake up in the morning, or in the shower when we're really not thinking about anything. But it's all kind of the result of our brains having been sorting and sifting through all of these reasons for change and how we might do it and who might help us and that kind of thing. There's no guarantee that people will come to a change decision, and we can't make that happen. But what we can do is create those conditions, and that's our role. All right. Thank you for engaging with those two. We're not going to take a long time here, but I would encourage you to reflect on your own practice and ways in which you might possibly be using the methodologies that the dentist used in the first video, and also how you might be using the ones she uses in the second video. And part of our process here is to think about, recognize what we are doing and not doing, and think about what can we embrace even more fully, and also what can we let go of potentially. So we'll keep exploring that as we go here. And Brittany, I am so appreciating. I think it's important that we remember that it's okay for a patient to not do anything at all. Absolutely. Sometimes the biggest win is getting them to continue to seek the care they need without expecting anything in return. And I think I might have mentioned this yesterday as well, and I appreciate your bringing this up. But there are some people who are not simply going to make many significant, dramatic changes, at least in their lives, but they keep showing up, they keep coming back, and they're gaining something from that. And we never quite know what changes they might be undertaking without our knowledge. And we just have to trust that so long as they keep coming back and are willing to have the conversations, even if they don't report in and give us the benefit of knowing what they're doing, we often can see that people do make changes on their own. All right. So here's a brief video. William Miller talking about what is motivational interviewing. He's joined then by Terry Moyers talking about what we don't want to do, and then by Stephen Rolnick, who talks briefly. And this is just another way of getting several voices in about introducing MI. So I'll play it now.
What is motivational interviewing? I mean, it's a way of having a conversation about change. And it's a particular way about having a conversation about change that listens to and calls forth the person's own ideas about whether to do that and why to do it.
One of the fastest ways that you can burn out as a therapist is being convinced that your job is to tell people to change when they're convinced not to. That's a recipe for burnout. And that is, in motivational interviewing, explicitly what you are not doing.
Why don't people change is one hell of a question. It's perhaps a useful question, but there's no single simple answer to it.
One of the things that Steve Rolnick helped me to realize was how normal ambivalence is when you're looking at a change. And to simultaneously want and not want something is perfectly normal.
All right. So a few key points there. It's a way of helping people explore their lives and talking themselves into changing. And one of the central characteristics that William Miller mentioned there at the end is this notion of ambivalence. And it's really ambivalence which has replaced the idea of denial, being in denial, as kind of a focal point for motivational interviewing. And so instead of pushing down and knocking down a wall of denial, what we want to do instead is acknowledge the normalcy of feeling two ways about something, to not want to do it and to want to do it at the same time. And then to help people talk themselves through that and hopefully resolve that ambivalence, we would hope in the direction of change, but that's really not for us to decide. So I'm noticing the time, and I do want to honor some breaks here for you and for myself, actually. So it looks to me like it's exactly 10 o'clock. So I'm going to propose that we come back at 10:07 and we'll start up from there. So please take a bio break and I'll see you soon. All right, welcome back. I'm going to share my screen once again. And I wanted to offer you the possibility of having an experience of someone speaking with you using an MI approach, and you thinking about an issue of your own that you've been maybe thinking about changing but haven't changed yet. You don't have to do this, of course. There's no coercion involved, but if you're willing, for the next few minutes, I'd invite you to think of some kind of issue, dilemma, decision point, attitude, behavior that you're kind of a little edgy about, a little itchy about, something that, you kind of been thinking, I'm not sure I want to keep doing this. And there's another part of you that says, it's not that big of a deal, or maybe not now. But something you're ambivalent about and something that is real to you. I'm not going to ask you to share this with anyone else. It's totally private. And so it's an opportunity, I guess you could say, for some free therapy, but really an opportunity just to do a little self-exploration, but particularly to have the experience of responding, in this case, to some key questions that come up in MI. And I want to be clear that this is not going to be truly an MI session, because I'm not going to have the opportunity to hear your response to my question I posed and then reflect on it and maybe ask another question, reflect again, explore it further, and then continue. So it's really kind of a formulaic way of doing this, but I want to do it because there are some key questions we ask in MI around motivation itself and strengthening motivation that are important to incorporate into our practice. And maybe you do this already, perhaps not. So let me just say, if you haven't already thought of something to change and you can't even imagine anything about yourself that would need to change, then I created this list for you. And no, seriously, I think what's important for us to remember that MI is great for conversations about, the typical sex, drugs, and rock and roll topics, but really it can be applied to virtually anything, including attitudes. So maybe, for example, you're somebody who holds grudges, or maybe you're not very forgiving, or maybe you're somebody who is perfectionistic, or the opposite of perfectionistic. Maybe you're kind of hypercritical or judgmental. Maybe you avoid conflict, but maybe it's also about, your behaviors such as screen time and alcohol use. We can certainly apply this to questions of our day, like getting vaccinated or not getting vaccinated, about all manner of things. So if you would, please choose something here, either from the list or from your own mind, that you're willing to have a conversation with yourself about. And I'm simply going to pose a few questions here that I'll invite you to take a brief amount of time with each one to maybe jot down or think about what your actual response would be to that. And again, despite the limitations of this exercise and what it means to provide MI, I'm doing this in part to just focus in on the motivational part of motivational conversations, because these are the kinds of questions that oftentimes we want people to ponder. So the very first thing is, once you've identified what it is that you want to change, is why might you want to do this? What are the reasons? Or maybe what would be the benefits of doing so? See if you can come up with at least 3 reasons or benefits of why you might want to make this change. Another question you might respond to is, what might be at stake if you don't choose to change? What might be some consequences or some things that would happen that would be not desirable? What would be at stake if you do nothing? So if you were to decide to make a change in this area, how might you go about it? What do you think might be workable for you? There are many pathways to change, many pathways to recovery, many pathways to Rome. um, what would work for you, do you think? And again, this is kind of a brainstorming activity. You're not making any commitments. You're just kind of thinking about stuff, and things might change. Another question would, what might be the very best reasons, maybe 2 or 3 best reasons to change? And this is getting at some of the importance or urgency of it as well. But what are the most compelling reasons for you to potentially make a particular change? I think you'll note that these reasons that are the best ones are often tied to personal values that you hold to. And so you could even identify personal values that are important to you as part of the reasons for making this change. Who could support you? It's very hard to make changes on our own oftentimes. Who would have your back? Who would be somebody you could rely on, turn to, even if you don't follow through or you relapse? Who would be there to still be with you and on your side and keep encouraging you? Could be one person, it could be more than one. The last question I'll ask is this: what next step might you be able to take if you were to decide to go ahead and create some movement in this direction? What would be the very next 1 or 2 steps that you could take that are very manageable, doable? They wouldn't require lots of effort, but they would be something that would move you along the pathway towards change. What would those be, do you think? It might be as simple as contacting a friend or doing some more research on the internet or reading a book about something or buying some new running shoes or whatever. Right? All right, so I'm going to just pause there. I want to emphasize that these are sample questions. These are not the be all and end all questions, but what they do is they get at different aspects of this idea of what we call motivation, because motivation has lots of different facets to it. It has to do with a desire to change, reasons to change, how you might do it, who might help you, how confident are you, next steps. All of these things are part of the mix of this idea of motivation. So out of curiosity, I'm not asking you to reveal anything at all, but I would love to hear from you which of these questions was the one that resonated most with you, if there was one like that. My experience has been that different questions resonate differently with different people. So if you wouldn't mind, just which one of these kind of was the one that kind of grabbed your attention the most at this point in time?
What next steps could I take?
Yeah, Yeah, who could support you? What are 3 best reasons? Why might you make the change? The next step that you might take, 3 reasons. What would be at stake? Yeah, that's oftentimes for people one of those that gets their juices moving a little bit. The support, yeah, wonderful. Thank you for that. It just, again, it rings true that one of the reasons why we often we don't ask these questions right in a row like I just did. That's really not the form that MI takes. But at the same time, we also often want to weave in more than just one of these questions because they do resonate at different levels at different times for people. And so it's worth keeping these in mind as you talk with people about various change pieces. I want to make a comment here, and that is that MI is not for all conversations. This is an approach that is really kind of specifically built for people who are either not thinking about changing or are thinking about changing but haven't really decided yet. Also for people who are preparing for change. But the idea here is that MI is really well suited for people who are not yet at a decision point, but instead they're really wrestling with it. They're ambivalent. And so wherever people are in those stages of change, we want to be able to use this MI approach. But there are times when we're not going to use MI. If somebody comes to you and asks you for some resource or bus ticket or directions or something, you don't have to ask them these questions, right? Just give them the money, right, or the bus ticket. And then there are other times when we're not really having conversations with people about change so much as we're just listening well. And sometimes it's more of a kind of a following in terms of being with them and hearing their story. And maybe there's a lot of grief and a lot of tragedy and trauma in their lives, like we talked about yesterday. But when we're having those conversations, we're not trying to, sort of help people build their motivation to make a change at that point, other than if you want to see the good listening as part of building the foundation for that to happen. But I just want to make sure that we're clear that we're not applying MI and this kind of way of thinking to every last detail. But when it does come to issues that people are wrestling with, we do well to take the opportunity to invite people to say more about these things. When people are approached in this way, when they're asked good questions, when they're well listened to, when they're provided with affirmations of their strengths, we tend to see that people are much more likely to experience these kinds of feelings and thoughts and experiences. And so one of the things we know about social services in general, health services, behavioral health services, information and referral services, outreach, that when we can create a relational foundation with people and then engage with them in meaningful conversation, that the more they're willing to engage in that conversation, the more likely that they're going to take the opportunity to think about making changes in their lives. And so when people feel safe, and that should resonate with what we talked about yesterday around trauma, right? When they feel safe in your presence, feel like they can talk freely with you without being judged, when they feel like they're understood, that they like being around you. There's a certain lightness of just being in your presence. They feel comfortable, accepted, respected. They as a result, people are much more likely to be open to change, much like David, who I think in that second round of his second round with the dentist, he felt these things, right? And so he was willing to come back. He was willing to have that further conversation. So really, this is kind of the gestalt, if you will, of what we're trying to create, the overarching kind of atmosphere in which we meet with people. Comments, thoughts, questions? All right, again, appreciating lots of engagement in the chat box there, appreciate that. So a few comments about MI. When you're practicing this approach, the good news is you don't have to be clever, complex. You don't have to be able to interpret things. You don't have to have high levels of training. It doesn't hurt to have high levels of training, but it doesn't necessarily make you a better MI practitioner, at least. If you can bring forward your best self and your compassionately curious self to any situation and conversation, then you are well equipped to engage with people in conversations about change. Now, there's a piece here about an uncluttered mind helps. I'd love to hear from you in the chat box. What's some of the clutter that gets in our minds when we're engaging with people? What are the things that get in the way, that are not helpful? Yeah, bias for sure. Our own internal biases that we bring forward, which we need to learn to recognize and name them and see them. Our own ego, our own involvement in sort of investment in wanting to take credit for change, right? For people. Of course, we only take credit if they change. If they don't change, we blame them for it. But our own attitude is certainly, and our own expectations can often get in the way. They cause us to go too fast or maybe too slow. We have an agenda, yeah, or maybe we have a predetermined idea of how we think the conversation should go and what we're going to say, and sort of almost like we script it out. And absolutely, our opinion on what's best for somebody else. And let me just say, we will have those thoughts and opinions, and rightfully so. There are better ways to do things than other ways. But what we're wanting to do is not impose that, but to really gather from the person what their own opinion is about what's best for themselves. And we can always offer our own input if we want to, but we start with evoking from the person. Yeah, I'm seeing some other really good comments here. Trying to get the chat box to move for me. Oops, not where I was going. Well, I'm seeing things like everything that I can't take care of right now, kind of have your mind elsewhere, right? And being aware of deeply held beliefs that come up for us, for sure. And this is where, let's be open and frank, this is where our own biases related to race and racism, our own sense for some of us, our privilege, our the things that we take for granted, as I say that as a white male in this society that we live in. We need to be aware of our attitudes towards gender and towards sexual orientation and people's sexual identity. All these kinds of things are deeply held beliefs, many of which are inculcated into us by our culture, and they just are part of it being there. And so we can't necessarily rid ourselves of those so much as be aware and set them aside, and hopefully in time they don't take hold. So other pressures, other work we need to do, all of these things are clutter. And so one of the things we did yesterday is we just took some time to calm ourselves and quiet ourselves. And this is something that is also not only true for trauma-informed approaches, but for MI, that we have to find ways to calm ourselves, quiet ourselves, sort of push out and aside all the other clutter and problems and issues and preconceptions that we have, so that we can bring our best and most genuine selves forward in order to be responsive to people, not reactive to them, or preemptive, or kind of becoming the expert in the room, the sole expert in the room. All right, so another thought about MI, and I referenced this earlier, is not the entire conversation is about facing forward, but we often do talk with people about the present. How's it going? Tell me, what concerns, if any, you have about whatever it is that you're talking about. And tell me about in the past, what was it like? What did you use to cope and that kind of thing? But we don't want to lose the opportunity to also give reference to the future and help people look forward and imagine a different future. And again, one of the better ways we can do this is by asking questions such as, as you look ahead, or if you were to, or, as you think about what life might be like without, opiates, what do you think about that kind of thing? So some definitions: a collaborative conversation style. And I'm going to just pause there. I think style is such an important part of this definition. It is and William Miller talks about MI as a way of being with people, right? And that will take you a long way. But when you add to that way of being some particular skill sets, then you have a really rich kind of interaction going. So it's a collaborative, a partnering conversation style with the hopes and intentions that the person will be able to strengthen their own motivation and commitment to change. So notice the word own motivation. The premise of MI is that we don't motivate people. We can't motivate people. We can't change people. We can't empower people. What we can do is we can create the conditions under which people do feel ready to change, do feel more empowered, but it's coming from within. And so the premise of MI is that people already have within them the motivation that they need to move forward. It's just that motivation sometimes gets covered up with lots of other distractions and with trauma and with preoccupations, and it gets squelched and pushed down for many people. But the belief, again, as I said yesterday, is that people have within them motivations to be able to live their best lives, to be able to be healthy and connected to others, to live a life of meaning, whatever that means, to live a life that is happy, that is joyful, and maybe even giving back. I truly believe that resides within every human being, in their spirit, their soul, wherever these things reside, right? And it's our task to really tap into that and help people uncover it and find out what those deeply held desires and aspirations and values are. We might also call it a person-centered counseling style. Again, there's that word style. And it's also focused on this common problem of ambivalence about change, which we mentioned. And ambivalence, of course, is really this really interesting simultaneous existence of these contradictory feelings and attitudes. When you're maybe trying to watch your diet and watch what you eat, and you find yourself ending up at a party and there's a table with all kinds of wonderful desserts on it, it wouldn't be uncommon for somebody to say either quietly or aloud, "Oh, I really shouldn't." That's an ambivalent statement because there's another part to that statement, isn't there? It's, I really shouldn't, but I'm going to anyway because I'm at a party. Or they might say, and I'm gonna hold off. And so that ambivalence shows up, it's in the air, it's everywhere. Some of you are ambivalent right now about all manner of things, including the possibility of being in this 4-hour workshop all day today. Think about it. You could be out there helping people, changing their lives, but instead you're held captive in this room with this guy talking at you on a screen. Okay, I hope I'm joking a little bit, but the point being is that ambivalence is very normal. And so we should recognize it as such. It's so normal that we see it all kinds of places, especially on sports uniforms. This, of course, is the Nike symbol, although it's a little bit distorted. And this is what this symbol means here. And you kind of want to just do it, but not really. which applies to going to work, maybe. It certainly applies to, lots of different behaviors that we engage in. But this is the essence of ambivalence, this kind of holding on to these sort of simultaneous kind of conflicting emotions, thoughts, feelings, behaviors. So what are we doing here? Well, going back to some definitions, we're really trying to find a way to help people talk themselves into changing. And so that is really the essence, which precludes the fact of us trying to talk people into changing, which is a very normal thing that we try to do. That's exactly what the dentist did in the first video. She tried to talk him into changing, and you saw the outcome. Not pretty. But then in the second video, she actually tried to help him talk himself into changing by providing some guiding questions and reflections and stir the pot, if you will, for him to consider change. And that's really what we're about. So you can see in this approach already that there's some humility that we need to exercise, some humbleness, because we don't get to show off all of the great knowledge and wisdom that we have. We don't get to, sort of show how expert we are and how effective we are, except in the realm of being really expert at facilitating helpful conversations with people. That's our expertise, amongst all the other things we know. And certainly there's much more to it than that. But around motivational conversation, you get to show off in a very low-key way how effective you are at engaging people, finding a focus, and evoking their own motivation around there. So thank you for your already existing humbleness that I see in your faces. Talking ourselves into changing, this is way too simplified, but really we all talk ourselves into change. Nobody talks us into change. They might talk us into conformity or temporary change, but it's not usually long lasting. But what we're doing is we're all taking into account what our behaviors are, and we sort of compare and contrast them with what we hope to be, how we want to be in the world, what fears are playing on us, what's priority for us, all of these things. We're kind of having this conversation with ourselves. And out of that will often come statements that are motivational statements, such as, I'd really like things to be different, or I'd like to be able to get more exercise and eat more healthfully. And I have reasons to do that. And, I do have ways I could do that. And it's pretty important to me. We call this preparatory change talk because it's not yet ready for action talk. It's really just that idea of brainstorming with ourselves about, what would be the good things about possibly changing. And then we would hope in time, it would become what we'll call mobilizing change talk or taking action change talk. And that's when we start hearing people say things like, yeah, I'm going to do something about it. I'm going to try that on. I'm going to take a step and do something. I'm going to fix the chain on my bicycle so I can get out there and ride it more, right? Have you ever met this girl? Been this girl, even if you're a guy? Let me just ask you in the chat box, what would many people say, what words would they use to describe her that would be negative characteristics or deficit-based? What are the things that are kind of maybe off-putting or scary that they might say? She's naughty, she's stubborn, a lot of stubborns coming in. She's sulking, she's disrespectful, sassy, yep. She ain't gonna do it for sure. She's pouty. And so, yeah, these are all the kinds of things that we might hear other people describe her as in particular, because the first thing we see when we see anybody is that first impression. We do a reading, our brains do a reading of that, right? This is the trauma response again. And our minds go to what our minds have in our memory. And And so this is a bratty girl who's stubborn and pouty and uncooperative and oppositional and all of these things. And of course, in medical terms, medical circles, we'd say she's non-compliant or non-adherent. She's not doing what we want her to do, basically, right? And yes, she's hard-headed. Now I want to show you a picture of a different girl. There she is. What would you say are the really cool things about her? Positive strengths, characteristics. What do you like about her? What do you admire about her, even? She is determined and expressive. She expresses herself very clearly. She's communicating her needs beautifully, yes. She knows what she wants. She knows her mind, yeah. She's an advocate, absolutely, for herself. And she's got good eye contact. She's gonna look you in the eye. And so Anna, that was kind of a tongue-in-cheek statement. It's the same girl, just positioned differently on the screen. My attempt at humor, sorry. But she's brave, isn't she? She's courageous. And so she's all of these things that we can rightfully say that we think are wonderful attributes that she has. And honestly, I mean, wouldn't you want your own kid to have these attributes, right? But we still have this problem because, remember her? So the question is not so much which is it, but the question is, how do we take into account that there are many ways to see people and different lenses to see them, and what lens are we going to choose to see her through? And that will have a huge impact on our attitude towards her, how we interact with her, our facial expressions, the words we use. And so I'm just going to pause here and make what the obvious, even more obvious. You all work with clients, patients, guests, right? Or other people, human beings in some way. And let's face it, we like some of them more than others. They're easier to get along with. We have more in common. Some people are even irritating, and we don't like them very well, right? And that is so natural. That is so human. But in our work, particularly when we encounter people who are, shall we say, less than user-friendly in the way they approach us, it is our obligation to be able to use a lens that sees them not only for that not so good part, but also for the good part. And that's what we call strengths-based, right? And so this is something which I think all of us need to practice and become good at, because we naturally see in front of us what is going to be scary, or again, in trauma terms, something that's a threat, right? And in some ways, this girl's a threat. But if we see her through that other lens, then we see her very differently. And I'm not here to suggest it's an either or. I think we continue to need to see everybody through multiple lenses, but oftentimes we're so quick to see them through the deficits and much less so through their strengths. Another way to put this, are the people you see essentially a glass filled or a glass empty? Now, anybody in the room who's a scientist who wants to argue that they're both filled, the one on the right is filled with gases, I get it, I'm with you. But by and large, how do we see people? Do we see them as empty and are needing to fill them up with things, or do we see them as already filled? And I'm going to propose to you that they're already filled with all the stuff that you and I are filled with. Everybody we encounter has hurts, trauma in their lives, but they also have aspirations and hopes. They've got nightmares, nightmarish dreams even, but they have healthy dreams too. We're all addicted. That is, where we all have unhealthy attachments to people and things at times, but we also have healthy desires. We're all delusional at times, but we're also wise, and so on and so forth, right? This is what it means to be human. And in MI, rather than thinking we have to give people something that they lack, what we're really doing is evoking from people what they already have. And that includes some of the hurts and harms and negative things that are pushing down on people. But it also includes the aspirations and hopes and strengths that they have. And the idea here is that people already possess substantial knowledge, expertise, wisdom about themselves. And it's our task to come in and really help to cultivate that and find it. And when we approach people and do it in a positive way, and we provide the proper conditions and support, it's much more likely that people will begin to trust us and be open to have conversations with us and with themselves about their lives. If I gave each of you a seed, and most of you appear to be probably inside at a desk or something, and I just said, here's a seed, please put it beside yourself here on your desk. And then I said, please make it grow. Well, you would be incapable of making it grow if you just left it sitting there on your desk, right? It would be the unusual seed that would sprout from sitting on your desk. But what if I said, please go create the proper conditions and support with that seed so that it has as good a chance as possible to grow and thrive. And then you'd all get up out of your offices, or you'd go find a pot, you'd find the right soil, the right light, the right amount of water. You would talk to the seed, maybe to help it encourage it. But we would do all of these things, right, to create those conditions. So I want to suggest to you that motivational interviewing is much more of a guiding approach from the standpoint that we are constantly, as practitioners, as helpers, trying to create conditions within the relationship and the larger context to help that person become their best selves, to grow and thrive. And it's not us alone, it's other people doing it too, but we need to do our part. And MI does that in particular by actually the way we talk with people and have conversations with them. And hence, that's why we call this motivational conversations. But it also has a lot to do with the things we don't say, what we convey through our actions and through our attitudes as well. Let me just pause there for a moment. Any thoughts coming to mind? Anything you want to share? Any maybe experiences with clients, patients that kind of illustrate this? Yeah, Mary Virginia says, being curious about what might be activating in you when in relationship with someone, deepening your own awareness and self-reflective practice. So I think you're referring there to the practitioner. There is something that happens in MI that is mutual. Not that we do it because we're there to benefit, but in MI, we actually, I think this is what you're getting at, Mary Virginia. If not, I apologize. But I think we need to recognize that there are benefits for us in practicing in this way because we are having a deepening awareness of our own compassion as well as our own self-awareness. And so there is a mutuality in many ways, which we're going to call a partnership in this MI style. And that flies in the face a bit of the medical model, right? Because the medical model is very expert driven. And there are places in medicine where absolutely it should be exactly that, particularly if it's a surgeon having to do a complicated surgery or doing any kind of intervention. That's not when we ask people, motivational conversation questions per se, although in the aftercare we might. And in an acute care medicine, oftentimes it is expert to non-expert, but in chronic care conditions, when people are living with diabetes and heart disease and cardiovascular disease, and anyway, living with, but also with depression and living with anxiety and other behavioral health conditions, as well as living with addictive behaviors. These are chronic conditions in which self-management, as you all know, is so critical to that person's ability to grow and thrive. And so for us, we are really using MI a lot with people to help them build up their own knowledge, skills, and motivation to self-manage their lives as best as possible. Katie says, I resonate with this. Then when we talk about people who have experienced trauma, we're talking about people whose conditions and supports have not been ideal for growth. So true. The problem is not the person, it's the conditions. So I so appreciate that, Katie, and I think it's a really important comment, because we're all too quick often to blame the individual for all manner of things in our society. And it's not to say people have no responsibility, but if we look at people in context, we can begin to understand what have been the forces that have shaped them, and what information they've brought in. I mean, this is very apparent in today's world, right? In our civic and political kind of separations that we're experiencing. We're not talking about bad people on either side, but we are talking about people who get information and input, and the conditions are very different in which they live. And so they develop very different attitudes and behaviors around vaccines, for example, and around lots of other things. And so thank you for bringing that forward. This is what I would make into a bumper sticker if I could. I haven't, but maybe you can. But what if we approached every human being we encountered, especially when it was around a conversation about change, and thought to ourselves, you already have what you need, and together we'll find it. Because this implies that many people don't realize that they have what they need. And in fact, our systems of care often kind of encourage people not to imagine what they have, and instead to tell them what we have that can make them better. And so much of our helping is externalized and done to people rather than done with and for people. And so MI is a way to be with and for people and to help them find their way forward. Not surprisingly, some meta-analysis of studies of MI have shown that there's actually a double positive effect of the impact of MI on people who have been traditionally marginalized, often people of color, people who are sexual minorities, people who are just often cast to the side. And I think what we might surmise there is that if you are respectful of people, if you don't impose upon them, if you honor their own autonomy, their own wisdom, their own traditions, all of that, which MI attempts to do, yes, you're much more likely to have a more positive impact on the outcomes, their outcomes that they create. Aha, time for another quiz. Have you studied for this one? So, have you ever changed anyone? Now, this is a simple closed question. Yes, no. Just curious what you think about this. No, 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 no. No, 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 nope, no, no, no. Except Hope couldn't help herself and said, other than yourself. And so Hope gets a special prize because the fact is you have changed someone yourself. Yay, Hope. But really, we've never changed anybody else, right? We've changed their diapers, maybe. We've changed the circumstances in which they live, or the way we treat them. But all of that has been impactful on people, but it hasn't actually changed them. It hasn't created change. And so this is one of the delusions that I think we live with sometimes, is that we think we have the power to change people. And I'm here to share with you that I think it's absolutely good news that we don't. it's such a load off, right? We're not responsible for outcomes. Now, another quiz question might be, can you make a difference? And here I trust that you would all say, absolutely, for sure. And this is our power. This is our power, not to change, not to empower, not to do anything other than create those conditions in which we absolutely make a huge difference. And we talked yesterday about role modeling and mimicking and mirroring, right? And so we as practitioners, regardless of being, what role we're in, and a lot of you are in community health outreach work, and a lot of you are probably in other kind of helping locations and ways of being with people. But we always are making some kind of an impact, and we can make a negative impact on people, but we can also make a very positive one. And people will remember you in particular if you come forth with this MI approach that is very much antithetical to traditional helping approaches, kind of like the dentist in the first and second video contrast. Now, here's a quote that I really enjoy. I think this will resonate with most of you. They say you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. But I say you can salt the oats. So that tells us that we can actually have a large influence in helping people become thirsty for change, but we're not going to force them to drink. And so this is really, again, just a way of thinking about our role. So I want to just pause here for a moment, and we will take a break fairly soon, but oftentimes William Miller has talked about motivational interviewing as a way of being with people. And in and of itself, that's not quite adequate. But I do think he emphasizes that because it's so fundamental to then the words that we say, the techniques we might use, everything else that we do, the questions we ask, the reflections, is all fundamentally based on this way of being with people in which we know we can make a difference, but we also know that we're not there to oppress and push down on people in any particular way at all. So let's look for a bit why any of this matters for our work. And this is part of the presentation where I'm not going to use an MI style. Instead, I'm just going to tell you why I think MI is relevant for your work, okay? You don't have to buy it, it's okay. But here's what we know about MI. Oh my gosh, where did that come from? Oh, okay. One, it's an evidence-based practice, which simply means that it's undergone a lot of research in a lot of settings, and particularly around MI with people who misuse substances. We've learned that it can be very effective in helping them change their behaviors. We can refer to this as practicing kindness or compassion with skill. And I trust all of you certainly come forward with lots of kindness, compassion, and caring for the people you serve. And many of you are very, very skillful as well. I would just say that maybe there are some things that we can even further develop in terms of our skills. And there might even be some things that we might want to let go of or do less of in terms of the skills we use, right? We know this is an approach that has been found to be useful throughout the world. We know that anybody of any professional background or discipline or no formal training at all can practice MI. This does not require a PhD or a master's or a bachelor's. It requires a human being with a heart. It's effective, and this is such a, I think, a wonderful thing. It's effective in briefer encounters. And some research has borne out that even a year after a brief encounter, that the change still sticks oftentimes. And well, for example, that second interview you saw with the dentist was a brief encounter. It might have been 4.5 minutes. Now we might say, was that effective? Well, it was effective in continuing to help David keep thinking about possibly changing his smoking behavior. And so, and it also was effective in at least making a plan for talking about it again when he comes back. So we'll call that effective, but it's also effective oftentimes in times when people actually institute behavioral change. And so just because people have really complex problems and lots of going on in their world, which they do, it doesn't mean that we have to necessarily spend a whole lot of time with them. In the long run, motivational interviewing brings things into a focus where we focus on one particular thing at a time, even though there's intersectionality amongst them all. But we start somewhere where the patient wants to start. And then we talk about that briefly and then create those conditions. And then we see where it goes from there. We know it outperforms traditional advice giving. We've all been on the receiving end of advice giving, and on the giving end, we know what that's like. People are actively involved in their own care. So, this is not a great analogy, but, sometimes if you have, you've hurt your shoulder or something, we might go to a chiropractor or a massage therapist who will basically kind of do things to our bodies. And it's very, very calming and helpful and often healing. But it's also not quite the same as going to a physical therapist who often engages you much more actively and has you doing exercises on your own, not just in the office space, but also then beyond. And so MI is more like T-guard. It's actively involving people, but it doesn't mean that both aren't helpful. But I think the PT analogy is probably the one that's a little more apropos here. We find that people stay in treatment, stay in care, stay in contact with you when we treat them in this way. We also find that you yourself end up feeling like you're in a healthier helping role. It's very challenging and hard to feel like you're responsible for the outcome. Now, there are exceptions here when if we do something really egregious, then we are responsible for a bad outcome. But here I'm talking about the fact that overall, we focus on the process of change, not on the outcome of change. And that in and of itself tends to have better outcomes than if we focus on the outcome. But we become healthier. We know there's research suggesting that people who practice MI tend to stay on the job longer. They tend to be happier employees. They tend to be more engaging and feel more human in their work, and experience decreased vicarious traumatization as well. And it's a hopeful way to move forward with people. Now, let's look at what MI is not, and then we will take another break. But it's not just being nice, even though being nice is a good starting point, but it's not just that. It's not a way to trick people into what we want them to do, even though we are tempted to do that sometimes. And it's not just a set of techniques. I already talked about a way of being, but it also does have techniques. There are different ways we elicit change talk. There are different ways we listen and ask that are, or we use scaling questions. These are all techniques, but they're done in the context of a relational approach. It's certainly not a solution to all clinical problems. MI doesn't work all the time, if you will, although overarchingly, all of the research that's been done about MI does tend to show that it tends to work better overall in most cases than other more traditional approaches, which is why MI continues to become popular for us. It's not the same as the stages of change, the trans-theoretical model of change that some of you are familiar with. I think the stages of change is a good and helpful kind of framework because it recognizes that people, are not always ready to change. They're thinking about it maybe, or maybe not even thinking about it. And so we need to meet people where they are in those stages. But I will say that by and large, that I think, and we'll be talking about the 4 processes of change, I think those are a little more helpful maybe in how we think about change. So it's just that sometimes when people say, oh yeah, MI, that's stages of change, right? And the answer to that is no, it's not actually. They get conflated with each other. All right, again, thank you so much for your time, attention. We're kind of at the midway mark here. I'm gonna propose we take a break. And again, my clock says 11:03. Let's go ahead and come back at 11:11. How's that for a nice set of ones? So I'll see you soon. All right, let's resume. Thank you for returning. Again, appreciate all of you being here today and engaging this. I think that what I'd like to do now is just, this is kind of a synopsis, if you will, of kind of what we've been talking about thus far, but also talks about this notion of our focusing on the outcomes. And this is a video that William Miller narrates, and he's really talking about lifting the burden of focusing on the outcome. And so let's listen, and we can have some brief discussion about it then.
Fundamentally, motivational interviewing involves a change in role, a change in how you think about what you're doing. You're not the expert there to fix the person. You don't have to make the person change. The truth is, in fact, that you can't make a person change. You don't have to be the one to come up with all the good ideas. A person with really good ideas is sitting across from you and may have better ideas than you do. It's not like a competitive sport. It's not like wrestling where you try to defeat and pin and outsmart and outwit the person. It's more like dancing together, moving together, adjusting your movements to the other person. Overall, motivational interviewing is not a directive approach. Neither is it just a following approach. Following is listening to the person and kind of going wherever they go. Motivational interviewing is in the middle, between those two, and we describe it as guiding. If you go to another country and you hire a guide, you don't expect the guide just to follow you around. That's not what you're looking for. Neither do you expect the guide to order you when you will arrive, when you will leave, what you want to see, what you will enjoy, what you're going to do. That's not a good guide either. Good guiding involves good listening as well as your own expertise. A good guide will find out where you want to go, what you're interested in, what you're hoping for on this journey, and then help you get there using his or her own expertise, enjoyably, safely, efficiently, perhaps. That's the guide's job. Not solely directing, not solely following. There's some of each in it, but it's a blend of those things. This may or may not be the way you've been thinking about your own work, but we invite you to try it out.
All right. Just to reiterate that kind of the following, guiding, directing approach, as William Miller says, there might be some of that in everything that we're doing, particularly if somebody's talking with us and we're just wanting to be there to listen and be, in solidarity with them, then that's more of a following approach, right? If something happens, there's an emergency, a crisis, there's blood flowing, that's more of a directive approach. Or if you see you're guiding somebody and it looks like they're about to fall over a cliff, maybe you want to pull back on the rope, right? But by and large, we're in that guiding role. And I think that's a really important, and it's an approach that lifts the burden from us, because I think it gives us the opportunity to walk alongside people without insisting what the outcome will be. Any thoughts, comments in the chat box about any of that? All right, well, I'd like to give you all an opportunity to have some conversation with each other. And I'm going to talk through this activity, and then we're going to actually have some breakouts where you have an opportunity. One of you will have the opportunity to be the guide and guide the conversation. The other will be the respondent. And I think we'll have a third person there just to kind of listen in, if you will. But what I'd like you to do is to take what we've learned thus far and to have a brief conversation, maybe about 8 minutes or so, 7 or 8 minutes. And the speaker in this case will be the person who's, again, talking about a change you're considering making. It might be something you came up with earlier, or it might be something totally different. It could also be a representation of somebody you're working with, but I would ask you not to make it the very most challenging person you're working with. The goal here is not to stump the interviewer. The goal is to give an opportunity for getting into a flow of this guiding kind of method. And so the instructions will sound a lot like this. And before I forget, I'm going to actually put into the chat box which is a PDF of this same listening activity. And so if you would at this point in time, I'd encourage you to go ahead and tap on it, to download it, and just have it at your disposal when we do these breakouts.
Real quick, Ken, with that, yesterday there was some confusion for some people. So if you click on it, and it might open up like a documents window to have you save it. If you do that, if you say save and then click on it again in the chat, it will automatically open. At least that worked for myself and most people yesterday. So if there's some confusion there, just follow it through and then it should open back up.
Yeah, thanks very much. And again, the idea would be that the person in the breakout, at least one person would have access to it, and that would be the person who would be guiding the conversation. But yes, thanks for those tips. So really the idea here is pretty simple. And I just want to say up front, it's really, it's awkward to do scripts like this or to follow these kinds of prompts. I know it goes against the grain of how we want to interact with people. And I'm just going to ask you to follow it just because it's one way of giving some illustration to ample use of certain questions that we want to ask in MI, and avoiding giving advice, and also listening well. So, sorry. So one of the things I'll say before we break into groups of 3 is that the idea here is and looks, and we'll review it together, and then not to have to pay a whole lot of attention to it, but use it as a reminder. So what I'd like you to do is initially just ask the person to, I'm sorry, I'm trying to get the chat box to move here so I can actually see what I'm doing. And that doesn't seem to be working very well. All right, well, anyway, invite the learning partner, invite the other person to talk about something, a change they've been thinking about making, and then just listen carefully without, intervening, without saying, oh yeah, that's my experience too. Just allow it to be a space where you give the person a good listening to. And so no advice, please. Just let yourself listen with the intent of seeking to understand. And then here are 3 questions which I invite you to ask, not right in a row, but you might say, why might you want to make this change? And the person says, well, there's this and this and this. And I'd encourage you, as your very first response would be to reflect back what you heard the person say. Whether you sort of understand the technicalities of reflective listening doesn't really matter. Just let the person know that you're hearing them, and just kind of doing that through your facial expression, but also through your words. And then you might ask, how might you go about it? What ideas do you have about how you might be able to be successful? And again, listen well, reflect back, and then ask the next question, what would be your best reasons? Again, reflecting back. And then see if you can summarize the kind of the why, the how, and the what that you just heard in a short paragraph. And there's no such thing as perfection in this. You just kind of do what you do, but keep it succinct. And then you might ask the other person, so I'm curious what you might do as a next step, if anything. So it's a weird, awkward conversation, I get it, but try to bring life into it and a flow to it that makes it more realistic. And then if you have time, switch roles or bring somebody else in of the threesome to take a different role. So have somebody hopefully have an active part. So we're going to give this 10 minutes, and let's try to keep each interaction to around 5 minutes, so that you hopefully would have a chance to go ahead and, well, let's say 12 minutes and 6 minutes each to have the interaction, okay? I keep changing my mind, sorry. Any questions before we move on? All right, I will not be lingering in your room, so I'm not going to be listening in, so just be yourselves. But as soon as we get into the room, would one of you kindly take the lead in helping everyone identify what role they'll play and then get going? And then we'll send you some time reminders along the way. All right, here we go.
Perfect. I will open all those rooms. Okay, it looks like a couple people did not move over.
That's typical. Let's see if we might
See if I can get you
get
guys to
some.
other rooms. Okay, looks like they finally all made it.
Okay, thanks. I know it takes some manipulating things to get them all in, so
Yeah, it's just weird how some of them don't move over.
yeah. Yeah, I'm sitting here triaging the material I have remaining because I have way too much. So what to do?
Gail, did you intentionally leave your breakout room, or did yours tell you your session ended?
Sorry about that.
Ken, I'm sorry. I had to step out really quick and I came back. So I'm not sure what we're doing. But I want to participate if I know what we're doing.
Yeah, no worries. What we're doing right now is we're in breakout groups of 3 and people are doing this guided exercise. So I wonder if we could just toss you into a group.
Okay.
I can do that. I don't know where in the conversation people are, or which groups are good. So I'll just put you in a random one.
Okay, sounds great.
There you go. Okay.
Let's.
All right, welcome back, everyone. And I think we're waiting for a few more to join us. Truth be told, I wasn't really keeping track of the time, so I really don't know how long that was, but I trust that it gave you an opportunity to have some taste, at least, of just the flow of this conversation. I'm sitting here realizing that given the amount of time remaining and the amount of material that I have, this is usually a 2-day kind of training, and I'm trying to condense it. So I don't want to rush unduly, but I think what I will do is have us move through a few other things here, through other topic areas, those ingredients we talked about, right? Stanton, thank you. Yeah, and if anybody else has any comments you want to make in the chat box, again, these are just tastes of getting a sense of the flow and how a conversation might go. And hopefully, whether you were on the receiving end or the giving end, it allowed you to have an opportunity to think a little differently. And Kristen, with 3 exclamation marks, is feeling motivated. So that's all good. Yeah. I don't know what you're motivated to do, but hopefully not quit your job or something like that. Anyway, thank you all. And I'm going to go ahead, unless there are other questions or comments, I'm going to go ahead and move us ahead for change. Thank you, Kristen. I guess I should have assumed that, right? So, and in the spirit of giving you all an overarching view of this approach, I want to have us go ahead and think a bit about some of these other ingredients that I've given mention to. And we've already talked quite a bit about what we'll call the spirit of MI, at least indirectly. And I'm not going to go through the whole variety of slides that I have around this, but it is a critically important piece, as you know, the way we are with people. And Miller and Rolnick talk about it as a mindset and a heart set, which I really like a lot. I mean, I also like the idea of spirit, but there are very few kind of therapeutic approaches we learn where there's an emphasis placed on how we prepare ourselves and the kind of attitude we bring forward. And I just think this is so critically important for us to consider. So it's interesting, when Miller and Rolnick later started teaching this approach in the 1980s, they talk about how they tended to focus on some of the techniques, which we're going to talk about here soon, of the ORs, the open questions, reflections, and how to do them. But they said over time, they realized that there was something vitally important that was missing. And as they observed people practicing MI, it was kind of like they were saying the right words, but they weren't really including the right music, right? It was like words without music, which isn't very good music if you're a lover of music like I am. And so what they wanted to do is really bring into play the music and the words together, so that you have this really compelling experience in talking with somebody. And so this is where they really started thinking about and writing about the spirit of MI. Now, I'm just going to share with you the 4 elements that we talk about and briefly talk about them. But this is an area that we could spend quite a bit of time on. But we're talking here about partnership. And again, the focus of partnership is recognizing that there are 2 experts in the conversation at all times. You have your expertise as a community health worker, as a practitioner, and the other person has their own expertise, of course, in what their hopes are, what their desires are, what their barriers are, what their experience has been, what trauma might have informed their experience. It also is a partnership in that they know themselves better than anybody else, and they also know their strengths, or at least can tap into those, hopefully. And so in this partnership, we're bringing people together, and in 2 different roles, of course. And in this particular role, the counselor or the interviewer, if you will, who's using MI, is using that guiding role, but putting the person at the center. They're the ones who are driving it. And the person is the one who makes decisions about what to focus on and when to focus on it. Whereas the practitioner is really the one who's sort of engaging them in conversation around that focus. Now, I do want to say there are times when maybe somebody isn't bringing up something, but it's a matter of concern, right? Certainly, if a person is showing symptoms of TB, well, there's a lot that's going to come to play in that, because there are mandates for that person to, be isolated and all of that. I think there are also, in this day and age, probably there's a need to talk about COVID and talk about vaccinations and all of that. And so it might be that in that partnership, in finding a focus, you might say, I realize you haven't brought this up, but I wonder if we might have a conversation about COVID and kind of how you see things and what your thoughts are about what you can do to prevent it and or to treat it, I suppose. But and it might even be a question of what do you already know about COVID? And so you bring up the topic, or what do you already know about use of methamphetamine, if that's an issue that the person's might not willingly bringing up, but you feel like it's important to talk about. So in that partnership, you have an ability as the practitioner to introduce topics, but primarily we want to ask people, what's on your mind today? What's most important to you right now? Where do you want to start? And then you have this conversation, and it's done within the spirit of acceptance. And acceptance has these different elements of honoring people's intrinsic worth and potential. It has the characteristic of recognizing that empathy and understanding is a vital part of how we interact with people and how we engage with people. It also includes honoring people's autonomy, their ability to make their own decisions for themselves. We can't make it for them. Acceptance also is all about accentuating and naming for people the strengths that we see in them. We call that affirming, making affirmations in MI. So acceptance is this whole kind of compilation of really seeing the person for who they are, honoring them who they are, and honoring their autonomy and their strengths and all of that. The compassion piece, interestingly, anybody know the root meaning of the word passion? And put it in the chat box, just out of curiosity. See how many Latin scholars we have in the room here. What is the meaning of? So emotion is a good guess. It comes close. It turns out that the word passion literally means suffering. And in the Christian tradition, there's the week of the suffering, or the passion week, right? We don't think of it that way very often, but I like to think about that in terms of compassion. If com means with, of course. So when we are compassionate people, it's an active stance we take. It's not just an attitude. And it's really coming alongside people in solidarity with them, honoring the grieving and the suffering they're going through without trying to fix it. And that's the key part. So often as helping people, we are so eager to jump in and alleviate people's anxiety and their hurt and their grieving. And there are times when that may be appropriate, but for the most part, we do much better as helpers if we simply acknowledge it and live in it with that person for a bit of time at least. So compassion, in my view, and there are many ways to think about this, but compassion is the willingness to walk alongside people in whatever their life circumstance. Maybe they're undocumented. Maybe they are living with chronic health conditions. Maybe they're a person who is homeless. Maybe all manner of things going on. Maybe they're having trouble in their marriage. But having a sense of being willing to enter into that story with them and be present and listen well, but without doing all the things that sometimes we try to do to make it all better by saying, well, it was meant to be, or it must be God's will, or, all things pass, or this too shall pass. I mean, all these things we say. That's not what we want to do. We want to be there with people, because when we acknowledge the hardship, the suffering they're having, it's a way of affirming them and saying, I can't understand it fully, but I am here as another human being to share in this experience with you. And there's something about that that's really compelling. Could say a lot more, but I'll leave it there. Evocation is the last of these: partnership, acceptance, compassion, evocation. Again, all of you Latin scholars out there would know that E, the A, or the E in the beginning means out of, and vocation is calling. So to understand and to call out from people what it is that they have inside. Remember that glass filled with all those things? Well, that's what we're evoking. The hopes and the hurts. We're evoking what's going on with people. And then we're also evoking from them why and how they might consider making changes in their lives. So I'm going to leave it there. The spirit of MI, you'll get some handouts around this, but it's such an important part of the foundation of this approach. But I'm going to leave it there for now. If anyone has any comments, thoughts, I welcome that. But we'll move on. We also have in MI what we call the 4 processes. And to me, this is kind of the parallel framework that's very helpful to the idea of stages of change. And what we're talking about here is, in the course of any conversation you have with someone, whether it's for 2 minutes or 5 minutes or an hour, there's a likelihood that there will be a certain flow to it that will begin with this first process of what we'll call engaging. And this is really kind of something that we're all familiar with. We do it with our friends over coffee. It's the idea of getting to know the person, catching up with them, getting to know them as a human being. But in our healthcare settings, it's pretty important that we take some time, not all the time, obviously, to get to know patients, not as a patient with a problem list, but also a patient who is a person, a human being in the world. And so we learn about their living context. We learn about what life is like in their way of being, what their work is like if they're working. Tell me about your kids. How's that going? What are some of your hopes and dreams? Because we know that healthcare is a whole-centered approach, a whole person-centered approach we want to take. And so when we learn about people, we can then often bring that back into the conversation as well, in terms of when we're talking about a particular focus. And speaking of a focus, you know, we're obviously not getting paid to just sit around and get to know people. That's lovely, but you'd probably get fired if that's all you did, right? Because we do, in fact, want to find a focus, find out what the various potential areas of focus are, and then find one where we start. And of course, all of these areas of focus will have some interplay with one another, but we have to start somewhere. We can't address everybody's problems all at the same time, right? So if a person comes to you and you know they have lots of big issues going on in their life, health-wise and otherwise, but they say, I really need some help in getting ID, I trust and hope that you will focus on helping that person get ID. That's the starting point where they're ready. And so we go there. Now, there are certain things that people might say they want help with that aren't within our scope of practice. And so I get that. But the idea is, let's start and meet the person where they are with what's of most important to them. Now, finding a focus in and of itself is a process, and it usually starts with a kind of a broad kind of, I want to feel better, perhaps. And then it's, well, help me understand, you know, what is causing you problems. And then we narrow it down further. And the person ultimately says, you know, I'm just anxious all the time. And then we learn more about their anxiety. And then we focus down even further and find out, you know, we ask questions. So what does anxiety feel like, look like? How does it manifest for you? What have you already done? And here we're starting to evoke, you know, what have you done in the past to manage your anxiety? What has been helpful? What hasn't? What do you know about other ways that we might explore to manage anxiety? What are the things happening in your external environment in which you don't have control over and yet have anxiety about? What are the things that you do have control over that maybe you can make a difference. And so the exploration might be, so, you know, what might be some good reasons for you to take your anxiety from a 5 to a 3 or a 2, or whatever the numbers are, right? So the evoking process is actually, we might say, the very, very heart of the MI process, because we've got a focus and we're evoking around that focus. And it's in that asking and listening that we're helping people talk themselves into change. And so each of you, when I earlier this morning said to you, hey, think of something you've been thinking about changing, but haven't changed yet. Well, that was my attempt to invite you to find a focus. And so each of you came up with something. And then I began asking you some evoking questions. I said, so tell me, you know, what might be some reasons why you might choose to change? Why might you do that? How might you go about that? Who could possibly help you? What do you think might be at stake if you don't change? And so on and so forth. That's that evoking piece. Now, in the long run, we would hope that it also will move into a planning process, but there's no necessity in MI for planning to take place, which might sound really weird to you. And the reason being is there's no necessity for you and I to be the ones who help the person generate the plan. Because in reality, many, many people make their own plans on their own time, in their own way. And we aren't privy to that. Now, it's wonderful if we can say, as the dentist did, hey, could we at least talk about this next time we meet? That is a plan. It's not a full-fledged plan for change, but it is a plan, incremental step plan. And so all of that to say is that we can't get too focused on planning. And the reason is, what if somebody said to you, hey, I really need to cut back on my opiate use, right? It's too expensive, and there are other things that I'm realizing I need to do with my life. And what if you would say, well, what are you going to do about it? Well, that's jumping immediately to the planning phase. What are you going to do about it? What steps are you going to take, essentially? And what we're doing, if we do that and we bypass all that other evoking, is we're actually robbing the person of an opportunity to build and strengthen their motivation and talk themselves into change to the point at which they are truly committed to it. Because if we jump immediately from, here's the focus, what are you going to do about it? What we basically are doing is we're assuming the person is ready for action, for one, and we're assuming that they already know and they're totally motivated to do that, and that if they do take some steps, they'll likely stick with them. And the fact of the matter is, people are unlikely to stay with a plan unless they have built up their motivation about the why of changing and the how of changing and who might help of changing and how confident they are, exploring some of these ideas and strengthening that. I realize that as I talk about these things, I get excited because I feel so that these things are so important, but maybe you don't share that, which is fine. But what are your thoughts, questions? And while I'm asking that, I am wondering if one of you would be willing to have a conversation with me for a brief period in which I demonstrate movement through these 4 processes. And you actually kind of did that already in the breakout sessions, but I'd like to have an opportunity just to demonstrate one more time what it might sound like. So any thoughts, comments on the 4 processes? And while you're conjuring those up, would somebody raise your hand or just speak out and say, hey, Ken, I'd be willing to do that. I think that might be worth
I'll volunteer.
All right. I don't know who said that, but
Stamp.
Okay, I'm not seeing everybody. Are you on camera by chance?
I'll turn on my camera.
Okay, great.
All right, is that better? I volunteered.
Yes, you did. There you are, Stanton. Thank you. You have a beautiful aurora borealis happening in your environment there. So.
Yeah, I just learned how to do that.
So, all right, well, let's do this. Stanton, just to set this up, I'm going to sort of guide you through the engaging, focusing, evoking, planning. Again, it might feel kind of weird and awkward, so be it. But let's make it as natural as possible. And I'll just ask you, please choose something to talk about that's not some deep, dark secret that you've never shared with anybody. We don't want you falling apart on screen, you know. But at the same time, not something particularly trivial. So something that's real to you, if you don't mind. And I'm just going to start by saying hello, and we'll dive in here. But Stanton, I don't think you and I have ever met, so I don't think we know each other. I'm just wondering, in the time we have together here, I'm just wondering if you might initially tell me a little bit about yourself, who you are in the world, things you like, what you kind of interesting factoids about you. I'd love to hear just a bit about you before we start talking about, you know, something else that we want to focus on. Do you mind just offering a few paragraphs?
My name is Stan. I live in Tri-Cities. I work in Yakima. This is my first time as a peer, and I'm very excited about the new career. You know, it gives me a chance to kind of delve into some of my past experiences and maybe help others. I have 2 children, 1 grandchild, and I don't know what else you need to know. I've got almost 4 years of sobriety.
Wonderful. Yeah, I don't really need to know anymore, but I'm always interested. Can I just ask one question? What do you do for fun, Stan? What do you enjoy doing that gives you pleasure?
Wood carving.
Wood carving. Nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
I enjoy doing that. And reading.
And reading. Cool. Well, thank you. I appreciate the little snippet. I have to say personally, I love the fact that you're a peer. I think peers in the workforce are the most powerful and transformative thing that's come along since sliced bread. And so I'm grateful that you're seeing that as a role for you and being able to make a difference. So it sounds like you have something on your mind that maybe we could talk about and explore for a few minutes. So can you tell me a bit about what that is?
Well, I'm working on quitting smoking.
Aha.
And I'd like to quit. I'm just not quite there yet.
Mm-hmm. So you're on a pathway, and the desire is there, and you kind of hope to get somewhere where you no longer smoke, but you're on that journey. I'm curious, what are some of your reasons for wanting to quit?
Well, I know I'll be healthier,
Mm-hmm.
live longer, maybe see my grandkids graduate and things like that.
So you're not only looking at yourself and your health, but you also are looking at your family and your future and being around for them and they for you to enjoy. But what other things come to mind when you think about sort of the why you might choose to quit at some point?
Well, it'd be nice to breathe better, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
And be able to exercise without getting winded, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Go upstairs.
So you're noticing how it's affecting your day to day in terms of movement, and exerting energy is harder, and just sheer breathing is, you're mindful of the fact that it's not what it used to be. And those are all things that you would hope to, improve upon. You know, I imagine that there are things that you've probably done in the past to try to quit. I don't know that for sure, but would you mind sharing just both what you've tried and or what you think you might find as a useful way forward when and if you get to the point of wanting to take action?
Well, I've got the lozenges and the gum,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and I occasionally use them, but it's kind of sporadic. Replacing it with, you know, walking around the block is something that I've thought about and done here and there. I haven't consistently done anything.
Mhm.
I will admit that I have not consistently done anything other than, I try to do I've dropped off a lot of cigarettes. I mean, right now I'm between 3 and 5 a day.
Mhm.
So it's like, I don't smoke one before bed anymore. So that's one step I made. I don't smoke one immediately when I wake up anymore, but I still smoke every 50 miles in the car, and some things like that.
Yeah. So I'm hearing that you've already made a lot of steps to cut back and have had some real success with that. Um, and the fact that you still kind of don't do everything consistently, no shame in that, right? But I do hear kind of this underlying movement that you've been involved with, and also a little bit of a mix of frustration and yearning with maybe not going the next step. And I'm just going to sort of ask you, what do you think would have to happen, or what would be different if you were to commit to a little bit more consistency, perhaps, or some kind of action to go a little bit further than you are now?
My first response to that is I don't know, but I think I can do some kind of substitution of some sort,
Mhm.
I don't know what it would have to take,
So you're at a place where you're generally okay with it, and yet there's this little bit of wanting to go further, but you're kind of not sure how. But substitution, can you say a little bit more about that? What comes to your mind when you talk about substitution?
Well, I know for a little while I tried doing sit-ups whenever I wanted a cigarette.
Uh-huh.
And maybe I could go back to that. I don't know, but I don't know. That one wasn't a very, very good method because there are times you just don't want to do that. And I certainly don't want to do that at work, but
a little awkward, yeah.
you know,
But doing something in place of having a cigarette is what I'm hearing.
yeah. And something that's not ingesting something, like I don't need to keep going to the food thing and then gain weight because,
Right.
because I'm not smoking.
So something that's both healthy, relatively speaking, and doable, and that you could do with maybe at the workplace as well as elsewhere.
Yeah.
Kind of what you're looking forward to.
And even if it's not healthy, at least not harmful.
There you go. Yeah, yeah. And anything come to mind, just in a brainstorming fashion at this place?
I don't know. It's like maybe drawing, origami, I mean, there's the things that I've done, but not on a regular basis. I don't,
Yeah. Well, and you also mentioned to me earlier that you enjoy wood carving and reading, and I don't know if that would be a worthy substitute in some cases. Maybe not quite. I don't know, but
yeah, I couldn't really carve at work because, I don't want to make the mess,
Plus, they don't want you carrying sharp knives at work, probably.
That's true.
Yeah, well, interestingly, I mean, what I hear is you're developing a curiosity about what that substitution might be, but you're not quite sure what that would be yet. May I make a suggestion or two?
Absolutely. Sure.
I don't know either, and I don't know what's best for you, but what I'm thinking about is, what if you simply ask some other people who have quit smoking what they've done?
Okay.
Or maybe even search on the internet and just see what other substitute, just to raise up some possibilities for you. I don't know. You don't have to take any of that advice, but what do you think?
It couldn't hurt.
Couldn't hurt. Yeah.
And that is actually something that I brought up the same topic when we did our breakout room, right? So,
yeah,
and I did talk to other people about what they've done.
Oh, sweet. Nice. Yeah.
So it's something I need to explore more.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well,
and I would say even this conversation is helping me because, I'm thinking about it. At least, one step toward it.
Yeah, there's something about thinking about things in our heads and then bringing it and putting it into words with another person who, you know, kind of reflects back and asks some questions that makes it even more kind of alive and real in your mind. And that's part of our process here. Yeah. Well, I guess I'm supposed to be actually teaching a class right now, I think, and so I probably should get back to that. But Stan, thank you very much for this short conversation, and I wish you well in your continued endeavor to move towards quitting.
Thanks, Ken. I hope this helped people in some way.
Yeah, yeah. I imagine it might have. Any comments, anyone at all, that you want to make? Any observations, any thoughts? It was a simple conversation, but it was a guided conversation. And I did some engaging, as you can tell. We found a focus. Thank you, Stan, for very quickly coming to a nice focus. We did some evoking. I didn't ask all the questions I might have, but we asked some. I did something there near the end where I said, can I make a suggestion? And we may or may not get to that, but there is this place, like I said earlier in MI, where we might offer some ideas, but with the caveat that, you know, you can take it or leave it, basically. Brittany says, thank you, Stan, for doing that. And it is helpful, I think, to hear other kind of examples of these interactions. And you have somebody in the same camp with you, Stan. So now you maybe you have a conversation with Alicia. I don't know, but the point being is that when we open our mouths, we put things into words, we see things differently, and then that often sparks new ideas. And I love it, frankly, when people say, I don't know, that's not off-putting. What it says to me is I haven't yet thought of other ideas. But you know, Stan, you clearly showed a sense of curiosity about how you might move forward. And that's really all it takes. That's the motivation needed. Yeah, so again, any other comments? Thanks, Kristen, for that comment. Again, just simply asking permission, would it be all right? And sometimes we actually will even say, you know, there is something I need to tell you. And I can't tell you what to do with this information, but I need to let you know that. And this might be around an ethical issue or an information issue that you, in your scope of practice, you need to share with the person. Maybe it's a concern, maybe it's a fact, something, but there is a way to also say what you need to say to somebody without saying or implying that somehow they have to do this, that it's not a threat. It's simply offering something that you're going to ask people to seriously consider. It's tricky sometimes because people do walk pathways sometimes that are very dangerous and they come close to the ledge, right? And so we have to weigh how we approach people, but staying within that guiding process is still where we want to stay. Yeah, thank you all. So 4 processes, again, you'll get some information to think about that further. I think there's, what I love about the 4 processes, it's not like it's new information. I think we all know this intuitively, but maybe it's a way of putting a little bit more of a marker and a map on how we talk with people. And again, I would go back and say that engaging piece, while it may not be part of your clinical interaction and you don't maybe do a lot of charting on that piece, that building that relational foundation, even in a few moments, is a way of saying, I see you as a whole person. I see you as more than just a collection of problems. And it's that going back to that trauma piece, right? Of seeing the person, of taking them into account, of seeing them holistically. Excuse me. All right. Well, let's do one more break here. It's 12:12, and so let's add 7 to that, and that gives us 12:17, and we'll return then. All right, thanks. All right. Once again, thank you so much for being so engaged in this time together. And this will be our last chunk of time together for today. And I should let you know that I will be needing to leave somewhere between 10 till and 5 till the hour for some other engagements. So we have maybe 35, 40 minutes together now. So I think it would be helpful for us to go ahead and look at some of these micro skills, if you will, or these conversational skills of MI. And of course, they form a convenient acronym of OARS. And so again, let's take a listen to a video. This is Terry Moyer just talking about the OARS for several minutes.
Let's start by learning an acronym that we use to describe these very concrete, engaging skills. OARS. So what does the acronym OARS represent? OARS stands for open-ended questions, affirmations, reflections, and summaries. These are the basic engaging skills in motivational interviewing. O stands for open-ended questions, and we contrast open-ended questions with closed questions. Closed questions, the answer is yes or no. Open questions have the value of helping clients to explore their own thoughts, experiences, and feelings in greater detail. A stands for affirmation. An affirmation is really nothing more than you noticing something positive about your client and bringing that forward in an explicit fashion. R stands for reflection. Here we're talking about reflective listening or active listening. You're offering a guess about what the client has had to say to you, but you're offering that guess as a statement and not a question. S stands for summary. And summary is really nothing more than you taking an opportunity in the course of conversation with your client to let them know that you've been following, you've been listening, you've been tracking, by offering them a brief summary of what they've had to say to you so far.
So if the Oars were a rock and roll band, which they're not, and when I think about a rock and roll band, I'm going to go with the Beatles, but we could choose other bands. Who do you think would be the lead singer? Would it be open questions, affirmations, reflections, or summaries? Who would be the front person in the band? John Lennon in this case. In other words, which of these skills is most prominent in MI? Which one do we want to really make a lot of use of? Anyone want to guess? Hope says, Brittany says summaries, open questions, okay. Any other guesses? You don't know the members? Okay, that's fine. So the answer is actually reflections. And so, thank you, Mary Virginia. It turns out that when we listen to most counselors, when people have listened in on conversations, there are a lot of questions that get asked. And so it's not surprising to me that you might have answered questions and many fewer reflective statements. In motivational interviewing, we actually turn that on its head, and we really want to use more reflective statements and couple them, of course, with some open questions. And then in terms of the other players in the band, the affirmations and the summaries, they're actually kind of back in the background, still vitally important to the band. They set the beat and they provide that baseline in this case, but we don't use them as frequently. Affirmations are used judiciously, not real frequently. Summaries kind of the same, but it's reflections. Often the idea would be 2 to 3 reflections even per open question. And so these skills are not unique to motivational interviewing so much as they're uniquely used in motivational interviewing. Hazel, thank you for your personal choice of the Moody Blues. I'm right there with you. Thank you for that. So let's look at these one by one. Open questions. What are they good for? Well, I think you know this already. They're good at gathering information versus just the factual details. They're good for creating an open tone, a non-judgmental tone, because you're really asking people to kind of answer something that's a fairly kind of has a lot of different places where they might jump into the conversation and respond. They're respectful from the standpoint that we're not making assumptions. When closed questions get asked, we're often already narrowing the conversation. But here we're showing genuine interest, and they have a sense of this compassionate curiosity, I like to call it, right? And really, very importantly, they invite people to think and to think more deeply, and to invite them to reflect on their situation and then to elaborate upon that, to say more about it. And so open questions, some are pretty straightforward, but others are actually thought-provoking questions. And so we want to ask the kinds of questions that do cause people to maybe pause. So when I ask you what might be at stake if you don't change, or why might you want to change, chances are you came to that pretty readily, but it allowed you to think a little differently and maybe about your situation than maybe you normally do. And they also affirm autonomy, because open questions are open enough that people can choose where to respond. So I want to compare these to closed questions for a moment. I think most of the time as human beings often initially frame our questions as closed. And I think the reason we do that in part is because there are so many various ways to do that. And so anytime you find yourself saying, did you, could you, have you, would you, do you want to, were you, where, all of these things, right? Almost going to a closed question in which we're looking for a concrete answer. And you know what? That's fine. We need to do that sometimes. What name do you go by? What is your preference? Do you want a tamale, or do you want an enchilada? I don't know. The idea being here is that there are times when we ask closed questions, but it's much too easy. And oftentimes when we want to ask open questions, we still frame them as closed. And so we need to train ourselves to ask open questions. And so what do they sound like? Well, they often begin with, tell me more. And I'm going to pause for a moment and ask you to put into the box here, what are some other ways? What are the words or sentence stems do we typically use to open up and ask open questions? What are the common words? What has that been like for you? So what itself? Now, we can say, what time is it? But otherwise, what is often a wonderful, what are your thoughts about? What do you think you might do next? So what was that like for you? How have you dealt with that in the past? So there's a how and a what that are really important. And then there's a few others which I would suggest that we maybe consider using more often. The why is a tricky one, because why can be a pin you against the wall why. Why did you do that? But that's not the kind of why we're looking at here. We're looking at, why is it that you think you might want to make that change? Or why are you concerned about that? And then there's questions like, to what extent? Or to what degree do you think you might want to consider that? It's kind of getting at more of the nuance. And then there's the question of, if you were to, or something similar to that, as you look into the future, as you look ahead. And the idea here is, remember we talked about the future forward-looking kind of aspects of MI. And so here, we're literally asking them to look forward ahead and imagine a different future, imagine a different course of action. And so these are the kinds of questions that I would encourage you to keep in your hip pocket, or wherever your quiver, or wherever you carry these questions. And but really be mindful of that. And I find I'm I'm often listening in on other people's conversations just in public. And I've gotten to the point where I'm very aware when people ask an open versus a closed question. When you go to a restaurant, for example, the waitress will sometimes come up and say, "Does your food taste good?" That's a closed question, right? With the hope that I sure hope your food tastes good because I don't want to hear anything else, right? But what if she came up or he came up and said, "How's your food?" Well, that opens up a lot more possibilities, including the possibility that it's awful. But it's also the possibility that this is really tasty food. And so there's always a risk, right, in asking an open question because you don't quite know what's going to come at you, but you're going to get the more accurate portrayal and perception of people. And the more real our conversations are, the better. Some other things. Can you expand on that? Would you elaborate? So those are also wonderful ways. So you can make up your own questions. I'm just putting some here that are more likely to lead to open rather than closed. Let's play with this a little bit. I really want to get off probation, but the court's making it impossible to do everything they want me to do. What might you say, and I'm going to sort of ask you to kind of just focus on one at a time. What would a tell me sound like in this case? And I'm not just saying tell me more, but if you took what was given to you here, you might say, tell me what? Or help me understand what? What might you say specifically? And you're welcome to unmute and say it or just type it. So I'd like to hear your thoughts. Tell me about what is challenging to get off probation. What's making it impossible, maybe? Tell me more about what are all the things they're asking you to do, right? We also might ask the question of, tell me more about your desire to get off probation. What are you hoping for? Tell me more about that, right? So we don't want to miss that opportunity either. What would be a what question? Well, what is it that the court's asking you to do? What have you already accomplished, if anything? What are your thoughts about what would make it more possible, more doable? And Stan, yes, the why question, which is coming up, is another. Why is it impossible? What's making it so, right? And so we can ask how are you thinking about this right now? How are you thinking you might resolve this issue? How would you like this to come out? And why? Why is it impossible? Why do you think it is that they're asking you to do all these things? Might even be another angle on all of this, right? Just to sort of get a sense of, the rationale behind it, the why of the court behind it, right? And then we might also ask, to what extent are you willing to fill in the blank, right? Or if you were to talk further with your probation officer about how to maybe make this more manageable, what would you be thinking of how that might happen, or something like that? We're making this up as we go. MI, by the way, is very much like improv theater. It's, we don't have lines that we've been given. We're not memorizing lines. What we are doing, though, is we're kind of acknowledging that there's a story there. There's a story to be told. There's things to be shared. And so we're asking interesting questions and we're listening well. And instead of saying but, we're saying and, because everything's linked to everything else, right? So I'm going to guess that some of you have done improv theater and you know this much better than I. Personally, I can't imagine getting up and doing it, but there's something about improv that's very much like MI. We kind of have a general sense of the structure of the conversation and the flow, where we want to guide it, but we don't control the actual content because this other person's involved. I know all the reasons why I shouldn't be using drugs. It's just that I like the way they feel and they help me cope with everything. And so again, I won't belabor this, but we might ask a few questions related to some of these stems or others that you come up with as well. What's interesting is when people say things like this, we might take it part by part. So if we just went with, I know all the reasons, what might be a question you ask around that? I know all the reasons why I shouldn't be using. Well, you might ask, what are those reasons? And what's your understanding of why using these substances is not helping you? We might ask, to what extent are they interfering with your daily living, with your relationships? If you were to decide to cut back or stop using, what might be some reasons for doing that? So we can combine these two. I actually want to use one that I'm not here. I didn't prepare in advance, but I think these days, and Carol had mentioned this to me too, that I'm imagining you're having a number of conversations with people about vaccinations, about COVID and that kind of thing. And so let's play with that a little bit. What if somebody said to you, I sure don't want to get COVID, but I don't know about this vaccination thing. What might be some interesting questions we might ask to explore that further? I sure don't want to get COVID, but I'm not so sure about this vaccination thing.
What do you know about vaccines?
What do you know about vaccines? Absolutely, would be a good one. Tell me your concerns about vaccines. What are your concerns? Yeah. What are you unsure about? Beautiful, yeah. You might even ask, have you spoken with your primary care provider about your questions? Or what do you already know? What has your physician told you, if anything, already? What other thoughts do you have? Focused on, I'm sorry, I'm on a different example. So what else might we say? The person says, I sure don't want to get COVID. What if we focus just on that part? What might be some questions we would ask around that? Maybe it would be, what do you know about COVID, right? What do you know of the impact it's had on other people's lives? What do you know about, the virus itself? What do you know about ways to prevent or at least cut back the likelihood of getting COVID, getting the virus? What are some possible ways that you've already been using to cut back your risk of getting COVID? I'm just seeing a comment here. This calls to mind also that at my clinic now, doctors are saying, hey, how are you managing right now, instead of how are you, when they enter a room reflecting 21 months into a global pandemic. All folks have been impacted. Yeah, absolutely. You're opening up a whole nother level of conversation here, which things have changed within us and around us and outside of us. And so how are you is kind of a loaded question now, and it's more specific around how are you managing, or how are you getting by? How are you surviving, right? Instead of how are you thriving? It really has been all of these clouds of misinformation and clouds of racism and clouds of misleading people and clouds of everything that's pushing down, including COVID, is just making all of us be a little bit more, well, we're being traumatized is what's happening. And so we're getting a little more specific though, trying to help people manage our own survival. Anything else on the question on that vaccine question of the person says, I sure don't want to get COVID. What might you ask? What precautions are you taking to avoid it? Good. Yeah, just questions like that. Yeah. All right. Here's one more. Let's try this one. I'd like to do a little part-time work to get some extra money in my pocket, but who's going to hire somebody like me? what's your first question you might ask of this person, given, I mean, you don't know much other than what you hear, but what might you want to inquire about here? What strikes you as kind of the first thing? Yeah, I hope I'm with you. I think it seems to me that there's such importance being placed in this question on hiring somebody like me that if we jumped right to the work question, I think we would be missing something really critically important. I'm not saying we have to address it first, but we certainly don't want to ignore the what's somebody like me. And what do you mean when you say that? Help me understand. Tell me more about somebody like you. And of course, we don't know, but it might be that we could make some guesses. It might well be the person has an incarceration history, poor track record of work. Maybe they have scars, tattoos all over their face. Maybe it's because of their skin color and their background, their ethnicity, that they feel like nobody would hire somebody like them, or their gender, or their gender identity. It could be any number of things, but we want to learn more about that. And then, yes, we would also want to learn about, tell me what work you've done in the past. Help me understand what you're good at or interested in. And why do you think they wouldn't hire you? But tell me more about that. And so again, getting back to that same question. Good. All right. I'm going to propose that we maybe just do one or more, two or more. Let's see. Let's go with, your drinking puts you at risk for liver disease, right? Good patient education. Let's say you want to take the judginess out of that and you want to convert it before you blurt it into an open question. What might you ask? And please know that it doesn't necessarily have to go focused right in on liver disease. It could, but it could be even broader than that. Such as, what do you know about the general health risks of drinking in general? But it might also be something more specific, right? And so it might be oh, geez, I just quoted you. Good job. So what are your thoughts about health risks of continuing your drinking? Yeah. How do you feel about your drinking habits? Yeah. What does a typical day look like for you? And what do you know about the long-term effects of drinking on various organs, including your liver? So you might want to bring it down to that. What do you know about all of that? What would you like to know about that? And so on and so forth. All right, a few quick guidelines. We want to deepen conversations by using thoughtful sort of questions that instill a sense of curiosity in a person and helps them elaborate. We use them to guide conversations. We want to ask more open than closed. We want them to be clear and brief. We're not trying to ask 3 questions in one sentence. And oftentimes we want to be careful about negating the first open question we ask with a closed question. So one example being, well, I'm curious, what are your thoughts about that? For example, do you think that? And so obviously it negates that open question and just shows that we have an agenda that we're getting into. All right, moving on. I'm going to jump to reflective listening, not because I don't believe in ORs and the A, but I think that reflective listening is really the heart and soul. It's the John Lennon of the band. And so we want to really get into this. And so again, when we are using reflective listening and reflective listening statements, we're putting them out there and oftentimes following them up with another reflection and then maybe a question. So let's take a look at these. So in physics, of course, a reflection is a bending back of light. When you look in a mirror, you're not really seeing yourself, you're seeing a reflection, a bending back of yourself. And so in language, we can also take what somebody gives us and tells us, and we can bend it back towards them and reflect it to them. Now, you can reflect it in exactly the same flat mirror way of saying exactly what they say. But if you do that too often, you start sounding like a parakeet. And that's not helpful. But what we want to do is bend it back in a way that gives a little bit more kind of depth and meaning to it. And so this is all premised, of course, on this idea that we all need a good listening to. You know, we all know about getting a good talking to, giving a good talking to, but isn't it wonderful when somebody sits down, pays attention, gives you their full attention, much like the dad and the kid yesterday, you know, watching TV, but just is present there and is not there to fix you or change you or to cajole you, persuade you, but just to be there and allow things to flow and allow your own wisdom to begin to flow. That's what we're talking about here. So reflective statements require that we actually listen in a way that we're thinking reflectively. So when somebody is talking with us, like I'm talking to you now, you would want to be saying, if I were talking about something of my that's, you know, personal or something, you'd want to be saying to yourself, I wonder, I hear the words and I think I know what the words mean, although I'm not positive, but I'm also curious, what are the feelings around that? or what are the concerns that I'm hearing underneath through the facial expression, maybe even? Or what are the hopes that I'm hearing here? What is this person desiring or hoping for? What are they wanting to have differently? These are the kinds of questions we ask to think reflectively about what the person is saying. So when we say active listening, we really mean active listening. You're taking what people give you, and then you're also thinking more deeply about that. And when we offer back a statement, we want to move a little bit beyond what the person has said, but not so far ahead that it seems like we're leaping. Now, I do want to say there are times when a simple reflective statement that repeats exactly what the person said, maybe a short phrase, is great. It's perfectly fine. It's basically saying, tell me more, but it's just making that statement. But we can't repeatedly do that. We have to then begin to offer reflections that sound a little bit more like a reasonable guess about the meaning, the thinking, the feeling, what they value, what they're hoping for, that kind of thing. We use statements instead of questions, partly because in the flow of conversation, if we only use questions, it starts sounding interrogative. If we only use reflections, it starts sounding a little bit kind of unwieldy and maybe too passive. But when we mix the two, that's good chemistry in conversation. But when we offer reflective statements, we need to notice the difference. You don't think it's that big of a deal? And of course, the undertone is, because I do. But you might also say, you don't think it's that big of a deal. Notice the inflection going down at the end. And it's really just a statement. It's not agreement. It's just a statement of, this is what I heard from you, and that you really don't see it as that big of a deal, which in turn is an invitation to the person to say more about that. And they might say, yeah, I don't think it's a big deal at all. Or they might say, well, maybe it's a little bit of a deal, you know. And so we put that reflection out there just to nudge the conversation further. You don't see your heroin use as a concern. You don't see your heroin use as a concern. So on and so forth. We hear what the person's saying. We make an educated guess. And one of the things we can do to guide the directionality of the reflection is to think, are we primarily here wanting to just show a sense of understanding and empathy, which is very appropriate, especially early on in a conversation, just seeking to understand. But we might also then want to form a reflection that sort of shows both sides of the ambivalence. So, and sometimes that sounds explicitly like part of you is wondering about, and another part of you, or on the one hand, on the other hand. And when we make these statements to reflect ambivalence, we often want to join them with an and rather than a but. The and shows that they are simultaneously existent and not necessarily fighting each other. But the other direction we might choose is just one side of the ambivalence is what we'll call the change talk side, the piece that says, yeah, I'm going to refrain from eating a dessert right now, or I'm not going to avoid exercising today, that kind of thing. And then we share it. And so let's do a little exercise together. But before we do that, I just wanted to share some common sentence stems that we can use to actually lead us towards some of these reflective statements. As I listen to you, it seems for you, you're wondering, you're hoping, you're concerned about, you're not so concerned about, you're feeling. So when we begin to just generate sort of reflection starters, if you will, with these kinds of phrases, they'll lead us to make these various and different kind of reflective statements. Now, I don't have it here, but one of those might be, so yeah, a part of you really wants to just continue doing exactly what you're doing. And there's another wee part of you that is thinking, I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure I should keep doing this, or something like that, right? So an example, you're talking with someone and they say, you know, I love smoking weed. I've been doing it since I was 14. It mellows me out, helps me relax. I certainly don't see any point in giving it up, at least not at this point in my life. So long as I'm not hurting anyone, I don't see why it should matter to anybody else. Drinking alcohol is much more dangerous than smoking pot. So you hear this, and you know, maybe you've even heard yourself say this or people around you. It's not an uncommon kind of statement. And of course, in Washington state, it's not an issue of legality or not, mostly. So what do we say as a reflective statement when this person says to us, this is where I'm at, and you want to convey a sense of understanding and of getting that. And again, we're not talking about agreement. We're talking about hearing the person and letting them know that we're hearing them. So if we just stay right now with the conveying what I call empathy or understanding, what might you say to that person in a statement? What would that sound like, look like? Feel free to put it in the chat box. Or call it out. Anyone at all? Yeah. You don't see why your marijuana use would be a problem if no one is being hurt. Good. Yeah. Yeah. You're saying smoking weed is a big part of your life. Absolutely. Yeah. You enjoy smoking weed and don't see it negatively affecting you. Yeah. Beautiful. Beautiful. So yeah, what's interesting here is you can focus on different parts of the statement, or you can focus on the whole thing. But what we're saying here is, this is cool for you, right? But what if we wanted to reflect the ambivalence? That means there would have to be the presence of ambivalence, and that means there would have to be the presence of, I'm not sure I'm entirely cool with it. So which phrase here even suggests to us that I'm not entirely cool with smoking weed, or I'm having some second thoughts? And just given time that I'm looking at now, it's really the piece where he says, at least not at this point in my life. It's very subtle, but he's basically saying, there's a little bit of me that kind of wonders if I'll continue this. And it leads you to believe that maybe he does see some potential long-term issues, at least, from using. And so if we were to offer a reflection of ambivalence, we might say, you know, weed is something that you see, it's a big part of your life. You enjoy it. And there's a wee bit of you that you think someday you might reconsider how cannabis fits into your life. And so it's just a little bit of a nudge, right? It's not saying yeah, and someday you're going to quit. No, that's not at all what he's saying. But you might reconsider, or you might at least be mindful about that. If we were just highlighting the change talk and the reflection, and again, you wouldn't do this totally upfront probably, but you might at some point just say, yeah, you're kind of wondering about weed and how it might fit into your life. You're wondering if this is something that's going to continue to be something that you enjoy and want to do. And so again, these are simple statements said without any kind of sort of big emotion or anything. They're just saying, basically saying, I'm trying to listen to you and hear what you're saying. What's important here is what we reflect is what people will comment on. And so if we continually just say, we understand and you love smoking, it helps you relax and it's not hurting anybody, and in some ways, in the long run, will just reinforce all that. But if we begin to reflect on the ambivalence or the change talk, then we're going to start seeing the person engage with you around that. All right. Well, I am realizing that time flies when you're having fun, and I've been having fun. I am sorry that we haven't gotten through everything. I am going to send you the slides I have. I'm going to send you handouts on motivational interviewing. I have no guarantee that you're going to read them or look through them, but you're most welcome to. I hope you find them helpful. And more than anything, I hope if you, wherever you're at in your learning journey with MI, if you continue or think it's something that you really think can be an important component of fitting into your way of working with people and your way of being in the world for that matter, I really think of MI as a life skill. It's not just a work skill, it's good for life. But be careful about using it at home with loved ones who know that you're practicing MI. That's a setup for failure. But at any rate, I'm going to need to stop here for my own schedule and also just to give you the rest of your day back yet. But I am so grateful for the time we've had together. And so since it says affirmation, let me just affirm all of you and the work that you do, the wonderful life-changing work that you do. And hopefully you'll find a way to weave MI even further into your way of being with people.
Well,
So
on
I'll
behalf of
pass this back to, yeah, go ahead.
on behalf of everyone, Ken, thank you so much for your training today and yesterday. We really appreciate your time and your wisdom and all the knowledge that you've shared with us. For everybody who's on the call right now, I will be sending out an email to everybody who registered. And so you'll get an email letting you know where the materials will be. They'll be on our website, both the recording and the presentations. And then there's a couple other attachments that Ken had sent us. So all of those resources will be on our website. Like I said, I'll follow up with an email directing you where on our website you can find those. So you will have access to all of these materials afterwards. Again, Ken, thank you so much for your time, and everybody have an excellent rest of your day.
Thank you all.